Hello there, and welcome to Midnight Geography. Tonight, we'll drift into the quiet contours of Maryland. Geography is not just what appears on maps, but what persists beneath surfaces. It is the patient work of rivers carving valleys over millennia, the slow dance between land and water at a coastline, the ancient stone sleeping beneath suburban streets. Maryland is where mountains remember their old heights, where waters mix salt and fresh in endless negotiation, where fall lines mark invisible boundaries older than nations. If you enjoy these peaceful geographical explorations, consider liking and subscribing. It helps other curious minds find their way here too. But for now, let's begin. Backbone Mountain stands at 3,460 feet in Garrett County, the highest point in Maryland, though calling it a mountain seems almost generous given the ancient humility of these Appalachian peaks. The ridges here run like vertebrae through the western landscape, parallel grooves in the earth that tell of compression and folding from tectonic forces that worked their patient violence 300 million years ago. The summit itself offers no dramatic pinnacle, just a gentle rise among the trees where three states converge, and the air carries a coolness that persists even into summer. Up here, the wind moves differently, unimpeded by the lower valleys, and when fog settles, it creates the illusion of standing on an island in a white sea. The mountain's name came from surveyors who saw in its long ridgeline the shape of something living, something structural, the spine of the land itself. The Chesapeake Bay holds approximately 18 trillion gallons of water, though such numbers become abstract when you're standing on its shore watching light move across the surface. What matters more is this. The bay averages just 21 feet deep across its 200-mile length from the Susquehanna River to the Atlantic, shallow enough that sunlight can reach the bottom in many places, shallow enough that storms can churn the entire water column and redistribute sediments that have been settling for centuries. This shallowness gives the bay its character, its vulnerability, its surprising warmth in summer, and its capacity to freeze in winter's coldest moments. The water here is neither fully fresh nor fully salt, but exists in gradients, a mixing zone where rivers bringing mountain runoff meet tides pushing in from the ocean, creating brackish conditions that shift with rainfall and season and the pull of the moon. Chesapeake Island migrates westward at a rate of 10 to 30 feet per year, though you'd never notice it standing on the beach. The island doesn't walk so much as it rolls over itself in geological slow motion, driven by storm waves that tear sand from the ocean side and deposit it on the bay side. A process called overwash that happens during nor'easters and hurricanes when water and wind conspire to reshape the barrier beach. The island spans 37 miles along the Maryland and Virginia coast, a ribbon of sand and dune grass populated by feral horses whose ancestors may have survived a Spanish shipwreck centuries ago. The dunes here rarely exceed 20 feet in height, vulnerable ramparts against the Atlantic, and during severe storms, the ocean simply flows across the island from east to west, carrying sand inland and leaving behind channels that slowly fill in again. In this way, the island maintains itself not through resistance, but through constant surrender and rebuilding, a kind of geological fluidity that ensures its persistence even as its exact location shifts with each passing decade. The Patapsco River drops 314 feet from its source to Baltimore Harbor, creating the fall line that made the city a natural industrial center where water power once drove hundreds of mills grinding grain and cutting timber. The fall line marks the boundary between the hard crystalline bedrock of the Piedmont and the soft sediments of the coastal plain, a diagonal stripe across Maryland where rivers suddenly lose elevation and their capacity to do work becomes obvious and useful. Long before electricity, the Patapsco's descent provided free energy, and the river valley became crowded with mill races and dams and stone buildings with great wooden wheels turning in the current. Those wheels are mostly gone now, but the geography remains unchanged. The river still dropping toward the bay, still cutting through metamorphic rock that refuses to erode at the same rate as the softer stone downstream. The sound of falling water that once meant industry now means only itself. Water obeying gravity through a landscape that tilts gently toward the sea. Fossil evidence places the ancient Appalachian Mountains at heights rivaling today's Himalayas before 300 million years of erosion wore them down to their current gentle profiles in western Maryland. The mountains we see now are the roots of those ancient giants, the deep stone that once supported peaks that may have reached 5 or 6 miles into the sky. Time and weather have been relentless here, wearing away the softer upper layers, carrying them grain by grain down rivers to the sea, leaving behind only the most resistant rock. What remains are these rolling forested ridges, humble and worn, their drama long since weathered away into a kind of geological old age. The same forces continue their work today, infinitesimally slow but unstoppable. Rain and ice and the expansion of tree roots gradually reducing even these remnants, ensuring that millions of years from now the mountains will be lower still, perhaps merely hills, perhaps finally eroded to a plain where rivers meander across nearly level ground. Calvert Cliffs rise 100 feet above the Chesapeake Bay, exposing 15 million years of Miocene epoch sediments containing over 600 species of fossilized marine life. The cliffs stretch for 30 miles along the bay's western shore, their faces constantly crumbling, revealing layers of sand and clay and shell that accumulated on an ancient ocean floor when this region lay beneath warm, shallow seas. Walking the beach below the cliffs after a storm, you can find shark teeth the size of your palm from species that vanished long before humans appeared, along with the delicate spirals of extinct gastropods and the fossilized remains of whales that swam here when the world was warmer. The cliffs erode at a rate of 6 inches to 3 feet per year, depending on the severity of winter ice and summer storms, each collapse revealing new fossils that weather briefly in the sun before being claimed by collectors or dissolved by rain. It's a temporary museum, constantly updated by its own destruction, offering glimpses of a Maryland that existed beneath tropical waters in an age we can only imagine through these fragmentary remains. The Potomac River forms 117 miles of Maryland's border, draining a watershed of 14,170 square miles before emptying into the Chesapeake Bay. The river's name comes from a Native American word meaning where goods are brought in, recognizing its ancient role as a highway for trade and travel, though now it serves mostly as a political boundary and a source of water for the capital region downstream. Near its source, the Potomac is narrow enough to wade across, a mountain stream tumbling over rocks in Garrett County, but by the time it reaches tidewater, it has grown into something substantial, a river whose width is measured in miles rather than feet. The Potomac carries the runoff from both mountains and Piedmont, its water quality reflecting everything that happens in its vast drainage basin, every farm and forest and parking lot contributing to the chemical signature of the flow. Deep Creek Lake, Maryland's largest freshwater lake, is entirely human-made. Created in 1925 when a dam was built across a narrow valley in Garrett County to generate hydroelectric power. Before the dam, the valley held only a creek, modest and seasonal, but the dam transformed the landscape into a lake covering 3,900 acres with 65 miles of shoreline. The lake reaches depths of 75 feet near the dam, deep enough to stratify in summer with cold water settling to the bottom while the surface warms, creating distinct temperature zones that affect fish distribution and oxygen levels. In winter, the lake sometimes freezes solid enough to support ice fishing, though warming trends have made this less reliable in recent decades. What strikes visitors is how natural it appears, as if the lake has always been here, the shoreline grown thick with trees, the water reflecting mountains that were here long before humans thought to trap the creek and create this artificial inland sea. The dam's purpose was electricity, but the lake's legacy is recreational, a place where people go to forget for a while that they're surrounded by geography that humans have rearranged. The tidal range at Baltimore Harbor averages just 1.1 feet, barely noticeable compared to the Bay of Fundy's 50-foot tides, yet this gentle pulse moves through 4,000 miles of Maryland's tidal shoreline twice each day. The Chesapeake Bay's restricted connection to the ocean through the Virginia Capes dampens tidal ranges throughout the system, creating a rhythm so subtle that many visitors never realize the water is rising and falling at all. But the tide is there, reliable and ancient, its timing determined by the moon's position and the sun's gravity, a cosmic metronome that has been ticking since the bay formed at the end of the last ice age. In narrow creeks, the tidal range increases slightly as water is funneled into constricted channels, but even there, it rarely exceeds 2 feet. This gentleness has consequences. It means storm surge can be particularly devastating because the baseline tidal range provides little buffer, and it means that the bay's waters mix less vigorously than they might in a system with more dramatic tides, sometimes allowing dead zones to develop in deeper channels where oxygen becomes depleted. Catoctin Mountain, formed from metabasalt created by ancient lava flows, rises abruptly from the Piedmont Plain west of Frederick, its blue-green stone weathering differently than surrounding rock. The mountain exists because of volcanic activity that occurred 600 million years ago, long before the Appalachians were even conceived, when this region was being torn apart by forces that would eventually create the Atlantic Ocean. The lava flows that formed Catoctin's bedrock spread across the landscape in sheets, then were buried by sediments, then were metamorphosed by heat and pressure during later mountain-building events, transforming basalt into the harder greenstone that resists erosion better than the sedimentary rocks around it. The result is this ridge, rising 1,000 feet above the surrounding lowlands, forested and steep-sided, holding within its stone the memory of an age when the Earth's crust was restless and molten rock found its way to the surface. Presidential retreats and state parks now occupy its slopes, but the mountain's real significance is deeper, written in the chemistry of its rock, evidence of ancient volcanism preserved long after the volcanoes themselves eroded away. Over 100 caves riddle the limestone beneath Washington County, carved by slightly acidic groundwater dissolving calcium carbonate over tens of thousands of years. The caves range from small crawlways barely wide enough to admit a human body to chambers with cathedral ceilings where underground streams still flow, continuing their patient work of dissolution. Limestone forms from the compressed remains of marine organisms, their calcium-rich shells and skeletons accumulating on ancient seafloors, and Washington County's limestone dates to an era when this region lay beneath tropical seas. The caves are relatively young by geological standards, most formed during the Pleistocene, when climate cycles brought alternating periods of heavy rainfall that accelerated the dissolution process. Inside the caves, the temperature remains constant year-round, typically in the low 50s, cool enough to feel like autumn no matter the season above. Some caves contain formations, stalactites and stalagmites and flowstone, Where water saturated with dissolved calcium carbonate deposits its mineral load drop by drop, building structures that grow at rates measured in centuries per inch. The Susquehanna Flats, where the Susquehanna River meets the Chesapeake Bay, once supported the Atlantic coast's largest freshwater wild celery beds, covering 11,000 acres. The celery, actually a submerged aquatic plant called Vallisneria americana, grew so thickly that waterfowl migrating along the Atlantic flyway would stop here for weeks to feed on its nutritious tubers, and the area became famous among hunters and naturalists for the abundance of canvasback ducks that depended on this food source. The flats are shallow, rarely more than 6 feet deep, and the fresh water flowing from the Susquehanna creates conditions where wild celery thrives, or did before pollution and sediment reduced water clarity. In recent decades, the beds have begun recovering as water quality improves, the plants returning gradually to areas they once dominated, though whether they'll ever reach their former extent remains uncertain. The flats represent a kind of transition zone, neither fully river nor fully bay, where fresh and salt water mingle and create conditions found nowhere else in the system. Maryland's coastal plain tilts gently eastward at just 10 to 20 feet per mile, a gradient so subtle that standing water pools easily across the eastern shore. The tilt is the result of the plain's origin as a series of ancient seafloors that emerged as sea levels fell, each layer deposited horizontally, then slightly warped by the weight of accumulating sediments and the subsidence of the land itself. Water moving across this nearly level surface loses energy quickly, meanders widely, and creates extensive wetlands where drainage is impeded by the slightest rise in elevation. The coastal plain extends from the fall line eastward to the Atlantic, growing wider as you move south, its sediments deepening from a few hundred feet in the north to thousands of feet near the Virginia border. Beneath the surface, these sediments contain aquifers, layers of sand and gravel saturated with groundwater that provide much of the eastern shore's drinking water, though the aquifers are under increasing pressure from development and saltwater intrusion as sea levels rise. The Monocacy River earned its name from a Native American word, meaning river with many bends, and it loops through 58 miles of Frederick and Carroll counties before joining the Potomac. The river's meandering nature reflects its passage through soft shale and limestone that erode easily, allowing the channel to shift laterally over time, creating oxbow bends and cut-off meanders that become isolated wetlands when the river finds a straighter path. The Monocacy drains a watershed of nearly 900 square miles, collecting runoff from Catoctin Mountain and the Piedmont lowlands, carrying sediment and nutrients downstream in flows that vary dramatically between summer low water and spring floods. During heavy rains, the river can rise 10 feet or more, overflowing its banks and spreading across its floodplain, depositing silt that enriches the soil and has made the Monocacy Valley productive farmland for centuries. The river's name acknowledges what surveyors and engineers often forget, that rivers are not fixed lines on maps, but living systems that bend and shift and rewrite their own paths according to the subtle topography of the land they drain. Paw Paw Tunnel, carved through 3,118 feet of Sorrel Ridge for the C&O Canal, took 14 years to complete through solid rock using only hand tools and black powder. The tunnel was necessary because the Potomac River makes a 6-mile bend around the ridge, and canal builders in the 1830s decided it would be faster to go through the mountain than around it, a decision that proved catastrophically expensive in both time and money. Workers, many of them Irish immigrants, drilled holes in the rock face, packed them with explosives, blasted, then removed the rubble before repeating the process, advancing only a few feet per day through stone that had been compressed and hardened by tectonic forces. The tunnel is brick-lined, its walls curving overhead in a perfect arch that has held for nearly 2 centuries, and walking through it now, you can feel the mountain's weight above you. Sense the ambition and desperation of a project that consumed lives and capital for what amounted to a modest shortcut. The tunnel is cool inside, dripping with groundwater that seeps through cracks in the lining, and the darkness in its center is complete, a darkness that seems ancient despite the tunnel's relative youth. The Severn River estuary contains 13 miles of shoreline, despite being only 8 miles long, its deeply indented coves and points creating a fractal-like complexity. The estuary's shape reflects the underlying topography. It occupies a drowned river valley flooded when sea levels rose after the last ice age, and the tributary streams that once fed the river became tidal creeks. Their valleys also flooded, creating the intricate branching pattern visible from above. The shoreline's complexity has ecological consequences, creating more edge habitat where marsh meets water, more protected coves where juvenile fish can mature, more variation in salinity and depth and bottom type. It also has human consequences, making the estuary attractive for development because nearly every lot can have waterfront access, though this has led to the loss of the marsh and forest that once buffered the shore. The Severn empties into the Chesapeake Bay near Annapolis, its mouth wide and its current weak, more of a tidal lake than a river in its lower reaches, the boundary between river and bay impossible to define precisely. Sugarloaf Mountain rises as a monadnock, an isolated peak that resisted erosion while surrounding rock eroded away, standing 800 feet above the Frederick County Piedmont. The mountain is composed of quartzite, a metamorphosed sandstone so hard that it weathers far more slowly than the schist and phyllite surrounding it. And over millions of years, the softer rocks eroded down while Sugarloaf remained, a remnant of a once continuous ridge. From a distance, the mountain does indeed resemble a sugarloaf, the cone-shaped form in which refined sugar was sold in centuries past, its slopes steep and its summit rounded by erosion. The mountain is privately owned but open to the public, and trails wind through forest to overlooks where you can see for miles across the Piedmont. The patchwork of farms and suburbs spread below, like evidence of how thoroughly humans have transformed the landscape. Yet Sugarloaf itself remains essentially unchanged, too steep to farm, too remote to develop, a piece of deep time rising from the middle of the modern world. The Gunpowder River drops through a series of waterfalls in its upper reaches, with Gunpowder Falls plunging 17 feet over erosion-resistant Cockeysville marble. The marble, actually a metamorphosed limestone quarried extensively in the 19th century for buildings in Baltimore, forms ledges where the river concentrates its energy, wearing away the softer rock downstream, but unable to erode the marble as quickly, maintaining the waterfall's vertical drop. The falls are surrounded by forest now, a state park protecting the gorge from the development that has consumed much of Baltimore County, and the sound of falling water fills the ravine, white noise that drowns out the distant traffic. Below the falls, the river continues through a wooded valley, its gradient gentler but still noticeable, the water clear and cold from releases from Pretty Boy Reservoir upstream. The Gunpowder's name has uncertain origins, perhaps from a colonial-era powder mill, perhaps from a Native American word that was corrupted by English speakers, but the river itself predates all names, a flow path established when the land first tilted toward the Chesapeake, and water began seeking the easiest route downhill. Ocean City sits on a barrier island that didn't exist 10,000 years ago, built entirely by sand deposited as sea levels rose after the last ice age. The island formed as waves and currents transported sand northward along the coast, accumulating it in a long, narrow ridge parallel to the mainland, a process that continues today, though sea walls and jetties now interfere with the natural sand transport. The island is perhaps a mile wide at its widest point and 9 miles long, its ocean side featuring a broad beach that must be regularly replenished with dredged sand to counteract erosion, its bay side characterized by marsh and narrow channels. During hurricanes, the island floods from both sides, ocean waves overtopping the dunes while bay water surges inland, and the entire structure can be submerged except for the highest buildings. Yet the island rebuilds itself, sand returning to the beach, dunes reforming, vegetation recolonizing the disturbed ground. The city built here is both an expression of confidence in human engineering and a gamble against natural processes that operate on timescales longer than insurance policies or municipal bonds. The Youghiogheny River, flowing north through Garrett County, is one of the few Maryland rivers to drain into the Ohio River system rather than the Atlantic. This northward flow seems counterintuitive until you understand the topography. The river follows a valley carved when this region was covered by ice sheets that blocked the previous drainage pattern, forcing water to find new routes. The Youghiogheny, often called the Yuv by locals who've given up on pronouncing its full Native American name, cuts through steep-sided valleys where rapids form over resistant rock layers, making it popular with whitewater rafters seeking Class 3 and I-4 conditions. The river's water is stained brown by tannic acid from hemlock and spruce forests, cold year-round from mountain springs, and it carries the chemical signature of its highlands origin, low in nutrients and dissolved minerals. That this water will eventually flow to the Gulf of Mexico via the Ohio and Mississippi seems unlikely when you're standing in Maryland watching it tumble north through Appalachian valleys. But the river knows its path, following the continental divide that runs invisibly through these mountains, determining which ocean each raindrop will ultimately reach. Point Lookout, where the Potomac River meets the Chesapeake Bay, marks the southernmost tip of Maryland's western shore. Its sandy beaches built from river sediments carried downstream over millennia and deposited where the current slows upon entering the bay's wider waters. The point extends like a finger into the confluence, a low spit of land barely above sea level, vulnerable to every storm that moves up the coast. During the Civil War, a prison camp operated here, and thousands of Confederate soldiers endured winters on this exposed peninsula, where wind came unobstructed across open water. The beach sand is fine and light-colored, constantly rearranged by waves and tides, and walking along the shore, you can find fragments of ancient oyster shells mixed with modern debris, everything tumbled together by the bay's patient churning. The point itself shifts subtly year by year, growing in one direction while eroding in another, its exact configuration determined by the complex interaction of river current, tidal flow, and wave action. At sunset, the water on both sides catches the light, and for a moment the point seems to float between two rivers of molten copper, neither fully land nor fully water, but some transitional state between. Great Falls of the Potomac drop 76 feet in less than a mile, where the river cuts through Mather Gorge and flows over billion-year-old bedrock that has resisted erosion since before complex life existed on Earth. The falls are not a single vertical drop, but a series of cascades and rapids where the river, constricted by the narrow gorge, accelerates and tumbles over ledges of metamorphic rock. The sound is tremendous during high water, a roar that fills the gorge and drowns out all other sensation. And the mist rising from the turbulence creates rainbows on sunny afternoons. The bedrock exposed here is some of the oldest in Maryland, part of the Precambrian basement that underlies the entire region, but surfaces only where erosion has stripped away younger layers. The rock shows evidence of extreme heat and pressure, its minerals realigned and recrystallized during ancient mountain-building events. And studying these formations, geologists can reconstruct conditions that existed when the continents were arranged differently and life was confined to the oceans. The falls mark the head of navigation on the Potomac, the point above which boats cannot pass. And this geographic fact determined the location of Georgetown and influenced the placement of the nation's capital just downstream. The eastern shore's Delmarva Peninsula is sinking at a rate of 3 to 4 millimeters per year due to post-glacial subsidence, while sea levels rise simultaneously, creating a compounding effect that threatens low-lying communities with increasing flood risk. The subsidence results from the slow adjustment of the Earth's crust after the weight of Ice Age glaciers, which never reached this far south, depressed regions to the north and caused a compensating bulge further south that is now slowly settling back down. This process is independent of sea level rise, driven by thermal expansion and melting ice, but the two phenomena work together to accelerate the rate at which water encroaches on land. In practical terms, this means that tide gauges on the eastern shore record sea level rise that appears faster than the global average, not because the water is rising more quickly here, but because the land is simultaneously dropping. The effect is most noticeable in marsh systems where vegetation struggles to keep pace with the changing elevation, and in coastal communities where streets that once flooded only during hurricanes now flood during routine high tides. The peninsula is responding to forces set in motion 10,000 years ago when the glaciers retreated, a reminder that the landscape continues adjusting to past climate conditions, even as new changes accumulate. Cunningham Falls, Maryland's tallest cascading waterfall, drops 78 feet down a rocky face in Catoctin Mountain Park, fed by snowmelt and rain rather than permanent springs, which means its volume varies dramatically with the seasons. In spring, after heavy rains or winter snowmelt, the falls roar with impressive volume, water sheeting across the entire rock face and creating a curtain of white that can be heard from the parking area. By late summer in dry years, the flow reduces to a trickle, barely wetting the rocks, and the fall becomes more visible in its structure. The individual ledges and shelves that break the water's descent into distinct stages. The rock here is the same greenstone that forms Catoctin Mountain, resistant metabasalt that erodes slowly and maintains the waterfall's vertical character, rather than allowing it to slump into rapids. Around the falls, hemlock trees grow in the cool, moist microclimate created by the spray, their presence a reminder of glacial periods when such trees grew throughout the region before retreating to these protected niches as the climate warmed. In winter, the falls can freeze partially, creating curtains of ice that grow throughout the season, and the sound changes from the rush of water to the sporadic drip and tinkle of melt. The Patuxent River, Maryland's longest river lying entirely within the state, flows 110 miles from its source near Mount Airy to the Chesapeake Bay, draining the narrow watershed between the Potomac to the west and the bay to the east. The river begins as a small stream in the Piedmont, gaining volume as tributaries join from both sides, and by the time it reaches tidewater, it has become substantial enough to be navigable by small craft. The Patuxent's watershed is relatively undeveloped compared to other regional rivers, protected in part by extensive federal and state holdings, including Patuxent Research Refuge and Fort Meade, and this protection has kept water quality better than in more urbanized systems. The river's name comes from a Native American word whose meaning is lost, though various theories suggest it referred to waterfalls or rapids, that once characterized the fall line section. Today, the river is known for its fishing, particularly for striped bass that migrate up from the bay to spawn in the fresher upper reaches, and for its role as a natural laboratory where scientists study the effects of land use on water quality and aquatic ecosystems. Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge protects 28,000 acres of tidal marsh, where land and water merge so gradually that defining the shoreline becomes philosophical rather than geographical. The marsh extends for miles, its surface broken only by channels and occasional hummocks of slightly higher ground where a few trees manage to survive, and from a distance, it appears as a flat expanse of grass that shifts color with the seasons: green in summer, gold in autumn, brown in winter. The refuge lies on the eastern shore where the Blackwater and Little Blackwater rivers flow into Fishing Bay, and the land here sits barely 2 feet above sea level on average, making it exquisitely sensitive to water level changes. During high tides, much of the marsh floods, the channels overflowing and spreading water across the grass, and during storms, the entire refuge can become a shallow lake. The marsh is dying back in places, victim to saltwater intrusion as sea levels rise and push the mixing zone between fresh and saltwater inland. And where the vegetation dies, the marsh converts to open water, creating ghost forests of dead trees standing in water where solid ground existed a generation ago. Yet the marsh also demonstrates resilience, with some areas building elevation through sediment accumulation and organic matter deposition, trying to keep pace with the rising water through its own natural processes of growth and decay. The fall line runs diagonally across Maryland from northeast to southwest, marking where hard crystalline bedrock of the Piedmont meets soft coastal plain sediments, a boundary you can trace by following the location of cities that developed at the heads of navigation, where rivers became too shallow or rapid-filled for boats to continue upstream. The fall line is not a single feature, but a zone, sometimes several miles wide, where the transition from one geological province to another creates rapids and waterfalls as rivers adjust to the abrupt change in rock resistance. East of the fall line, the land consists of unconsolidated sediments, sand, clay, gravel, deposited when ancient seas covered the coastal plain, while west of it, the bedrock is metamorphic and igneous rock formed deep underground and later exposed by erosion. This difference in geology affects everything: soil types, drainage patterns, groundwater availability, even the routes of interstate highways, which must account for the different engineering challenges posed by sediment versus bedrock. The fall line represents the ancient shoreline of a Cretaceous sea, and walking across it, you're moving from what was once seafloor to what was once dry land, though both areas have been transformed by subsequent erosion, deposition, and tectonic adjustment. Antietam Creek, flowing 42 miles through Washington County, cut its valley deeper during Ice Age periods when increased water flow enhanced erosion rates, carving into limestone and shale that underlie this section of the Great Valley. The creek's name became infamous after the Civil War battle fought along its banks, but the waterway itself predates human conflict by millions of years. Its course established as the Appalachians eroded and water sought the lowest path to the Potomac River. The creek flows through farmland now, its waters often clouded with sediment from agricultural runoff, though in its upper reaches where forest still dominates the watershed, the water runs clearer. During spring floods, the creek can rise dramatically, transforming from a modest stream you could wade across into a turbulent flow 30 feet wide that carries trees and debris downstream with surprising force. The valley it has carved is gentle-sided and fertile, filled with alluvial soil deposited during countless floods, and this fertility made it attractive to farmers who arrived in the 18th century and whose descendants still work the land. Jug Bay on the Patuxent River contains rare freshwater tidal marshes where river levels rise and fall with tides despite being 35 miles from the ocean, creating an unusual ecosystem adapted to fluctuating water levels without the stress of saltwater exposure. The bay is really a widening of the river, a place where the channel broadens and slows and deposits sediment, creating shallow flats colonized by plants that can tolerate having their roots submerged twice daily. Wild rice grows here in summer, tall and green, bending in the tidal currents, and spatterdock covers portions of the open water with round, floating leaves and yellow flowers. The tidal range is modest, just a foot or two, but it's enough to expose mudflats at low tide where wading birds probe for invertebrates and to flood the lower marsh at high tide, submerging the vegetation except for the tallest stems. The bay serves as a nursery for fish that spawn in the river and whose juveniles find protection among the marsh plants, and as a resting point for migratory waterfowl moving along the Atlantic flyway. The marsh's freshwater character makes it particularly valuable because such systems are rarer than salt marshes, most tidal areas being too close to the ocean to avoid saltwater intrusion. The Potomac River's width varies from 50 feet at its source to over 11 miles at its mouth, where it merges with the Chesapeake Bay near Point Lookout in a transition so gradual that determining where river ends and bay begins becomes arbitrary. The river begins as a spring in the Allegheny Mountains of West Virginia, a trickle you could step across, and it grows through the addition of tributaries, the Shenandoah, the Monocacy, the Anacostia, each contributing its own water and sediment and chemical signature to the main stem. By the time the Potomac reaches Washington, D.C., it has become a substantial river, several hundred feet wide, and below the city it widens steadily as tidal influence increases, and the valley becomes a drowned river mouth flooded by post-glacial sea level rise. At its widest point, the river encompasses several islands and multiple shipping channels, and the far shore is barely visible on hazy days. The expansion reflects not just the addition of water, but the fundamental change in the river's character as it transitions from a flowing stream to a tidal estuary where currents reverse with the tides and salinity increases toward the ocean. Dinosaur footprints preserved in 115-million-year-old mudstone appear along the Patuxent River in Prince George's County, left when this area was a coastal floodplain where armored dinosaurs and large theropods walked across wet sediment that later hardened into stone. The tracks are subtle, visible only in certain light, depressions where three-toed feet pressed into mud, and they've survived only because the conditions were perfect. The mud was the right consistency, neither too wet nor too dry, and it was quickly covered by another layer of sediment that protected the prints from erosion. The area during the Cretaceous period was subtropical, crossed by rivers flowing from highlands to the west, and the floodplains supported forests of conifers and ferns where dinosaurs foraged and left their traces. Finding these prints requires patience and knowledge of where to look, as erosion gradually exposes new trackways while destroying others, and each winter's freeze-thaw cycle can damage or obliterate prints that have survived for over 100 million years. The tracks are evidence that Maryland's geography extends not just spatially, but temporally, that the rocks beneath our feet contain records of vanished worlds where creatures that no longer exist walked across landscapes that no longer resemble the present. The Choptank River flows 71 miles across the eastern shore, draining one of the Chesapeake Bay's largest watersheds on the Delmarva Peninsula, its waters collecting runoff from agricultural lands that dominate the flat terrain between its source and its mouth. The river begins as a small stream near the Delaware border and grows steadily as it flows southwest, its valley shallow and its banks low. And by its mouth, it has widened to over a mile. More estuary than river, its water brackish and tidal for most of its length. The Choptank's watershed is almost entirely on the coastal plain, which means the river has very little gradient. It drops only a few feet per mile, and it meanders extensively across the flat landscape, creating oxbows and cutoffs and extensive wetlands. The slow-moving water carries high nutrient loads from fertilizer runoff, contributing to algae blooms in the bay, and restoration efforts focus on creating buffer zones of forest and wetland that can filter nutrients before they reach the stream. The river's Native American name translates approximately as "where the water runs through the land," acknowledging its role as a drainage system for this low-lying peninsula. Soldier's Delight. Natural Environment Area protects 1,900 acres of serpentine barrens, where soil high in magnesium and heavy metals creates a prairie-like ecosystem rare in the East, supporting plants adapted to the toxic and nutrient-poor conditions that most species cannot tolerate. The barrens are treeless or nearly so, dominated by grasses and wildflowers, and they appear incongruous in a region where forest is the climax vegetation, but the serpentine soil prevents normal succession and maintains this open character. The rock underlying the barrens is serpentinite, a metamorphosed ultramafic stone that weathers to produce soil hostile to most plants, but perfect for specialists that have evolved tolerance to high metal concentrations. Some of the plants here exist nowhere else in Maryland, and a few are found nowhere else in the world, their ranges restricted to scattered serpentine outcrops scattered across the Piedmont. The area's name comes from colonial times when the open character made it unsuitable for farming, and it became common land where soldiers could graze horses, its delight perhaps ironic given the challenging conditions. In spring, the barrens bloom with color, the grasses interspersed with wildflowers adapted to drought and poor soil, and the openness allows long views unusual in the forested mid-Atlantic, creating a landscape that feels more like the Great Plains than suburban Baltimore County. The Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, cutting 14 miles across the narrowest part of the Delmarva Peninsula, drops sea level to near zero at its midpoint lock, where water from the Chesapeake Bay flowing east meets water from the Delaware Bay flowing west. The canal is essentially a sea level shortcut between two major estuaries, eliminating the need for ships to sail around the entire Delmarva Peninsula, and it handles substantial commercial traffic, including tankers and container ships that seem improbably large for what appears to be a glorified ditch. The canal was dug mostly by hand in the early 19th century, an engineering project that involved moving millions of cubic yards of earth through coastal plain sediments, and it has been widened and deepened several times since to accommodate larger vessels. The canal's existence affects both bays, allowing salt water to flow between them and creating a mixing zone where species from both systems can intermingle. Standing on one of the canal's bridges, you can watch the current, which changes direction with the tides, sometimes flowing east, sometimes west, determined by which bay is higher at a given moment. The canal demonstrates geography's negotiability. What nature separated, humans can connect, though maintaining that connection requires constant dredging to prevent the canal from filling with sediment. Muddy Creek Falls, in Swallow Falls, State Park plunges 53 feet over sandstone ledges, its drop concentrated in a single vertical cascade rather than a stepped descent, creating a curtain of water that freezes into spectacular ice formations during severe winters. The falls occupy a narrow gorge where the creek has cut down through layered sedimentary rock, each layer representing a different depositional environment from hundreds of millions of years ago, when this region was accumulating sediments in river deltas and shallow seas. The waterfall maintains its height because the sandstone at the lip is more resistant to erosion than the shale immediately below it, creating an overhang that allows water to fall freely rather than sliding down the rock face. The gorge below the falls is cool and shaded, its microclimate supporting plants that would normally be found further north, and the constant spray keeps the rocks slick with moisture even during dry periods. The fall's volume varies with season and rainfall, impressive after spring snowmelt, and sometimes reduced to a trickle by late summer, but the basic structure remains unchanged, the sandstone eroding so slowly that the waterfall will likely persist for thousands of years before erosion eliminates the resistant ledge and converts the falls to rapids. Smith Island, Maryland's only inhabited offshore island, sits barely 3 feet above sea level on average, with high tides regularly flooding its marsh-surrounded communities, and the island is slowly drowning as subsidence and sea level rise combine to submerge land that was dry within living memory. The island consists of 3 small communities connected by bridges and narrow roads that are themselves threatened by water, and the residents, fewer than 300 now, maintain a culture and dialect that developed in relative isolation over centuries. The island has no natural high ground, no hills to retreat to as water rises, and adaptation means accepting that floors will flood during storm tides and that the definition of livable land shrinks year by year. The marshes that surround the communities are dying back as saltwater intrusion increases, and where marsh vegetation dies, the land converts to open water, eliminating the buffer that once protected the islands from wave action. The community debates whether to stay or relocate, whether engineering solutions like seawalls and house raising can preserve the island or merely delay the inevitable. Walking the narrow lanes, you can see evidence of adjustment. Houses elevated on pilings, boat docks built higher than they were a generation ago, water marks on buildings showing where the last storm surge reached, and the resignation that comes from living on land that is returning to the bay from which it emerged. The Potomac River carved a water gap through South Mountain at Harper's Ferry, following a path established before the mountain was uplifted, a phenomenon called antecedent drainage, where a river maintains its course even as tectonic forces raise rock across its path. The gap is dramatic, the river flowing through a narrow passage with cliffs rising steeply on both sides, and it's been recognized as scenically and strategically significant since before the Revolutionary War. Thomas Jefferson visited and wrote about the view, calling it worth a voyage across the Atlantic. And indeed, from the overlooks above the town, you can see the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers converging in the gap, their waters merging and flowing northeast through the mountains toward the sea. The gap exists because the river was here first, cutting down through the bedrock as fast as the mountain rose, maintaining its path through millions of years of uplift and erosion. Without this gap, the Potomac would have been diverted, forced to find another route around the mountain, and the geography of the region would be entirely different. The river perhaps flowing south to join the James rather than east to the Chesapeake. Tangier Sound, lying between Maryland's eastern shore and Virginia's barrier islands, averages just 8 feet deep across its 140 square miles, creating an enormous shallow basin where water warms quickly in summer and can freeze partially in severe winters. The Sound is really an extension of the Chesapeake Bay, a broad opening in the bay's southern reaches where the western shore curves away and leaves a wide expanse of open water. Despite its shallowness, the Sound handles commercial traffic, mostly watermen working crab pots and oyster beds, and navigation requires local knowledge of the channels that wind between shoals. The bottom is soft mud in most places, accumulated sediments from rivers and marsh erosion, and disturbing this mud can cloud the water for hours. The sound's shallowness makes it productive for fisheries because sunlight reaches the bottom over extensive areas, supporting aquatic vegetation that provides habitat for crabs and juvenile fish, though this same shallowness makes it vulnerable to pollution and algae blooms. The sound's name comes from the Tangier Island that sits near its center, and the water here connects the Chesapeake to smaller rivers and creeks on both Maryland and Virginia shores, creating a network of tidal waterways that has supported watermen communities for generations. The Sidling Hill Road cut exposes 810 feet of vertical rock strata, revealing 340 million years of geological history in a single slice through the mountain, a cross-section so dramatic that the highway department built a parking area and museum to interpret what erosion would have taken millennia to reveal. The cut was made in the 1980s during interstate construction, and engineers chose to blast through the mountain rather than route the highway around it, creating a gash that exposes the mountain's internal structure. The rock layers are tilted nearly vertical, demonstrating the intense folding that occurred during the Appalachian mountain building event, when tectonic collision compressed and uplifted sedimentary rocks deposited in an ancient ocean. You can see the syncline, the downward fold, clearly from the parking area, the rock layers forming a U-shape that plunges into the earth on both sides. Each layer represents a different depositional environment: sandstone from ancient beaches, shale from deeper water, limestone from tropical seas, all stacked and tilted and exposed by the cut. Standing in the cut, you're looking at time made visible, at hundreds of millions of years of Earth history compressed into a vertical sequence you can walk past in minutes, each layer containing fossils and chemical signatures that tell of vanished worlds. Curtis Creek, emptying into Baltimore's outer harbor, marks the city's original shoreline before centuries of fill pushed land hundreds of feet into the Patapsco River, burying tidal wetlands beneath factories and warehouses and eventually highways and container terminals. The creek itself is short, barely 3 miles long, but it drains a watershed that was once forested and is now almost entirely urban, and its water quality reflects everything that happens on those impervious surfaces: parking lots, rooftops, roads that shed rain into storm drains leading directly to the creek. Old maps show Curtis Creek flowing through extensive marshes at its mouth, providing habitat for fish and waterfowl. But those marshes were filled starting in the 19th century as the port expanded and industry demanded level land near deep water. What remains is a narrow channel between bulkheads, its natural form entirely hidden by human construction, though the creek still flows and still drains its watershed and still responds to tides that push salt water upstream twice daily. The creek represents what happened to most of Baltimore's waterways: channelized, degraded, valued only for their utility in draining stormwater and providing water access for industry, though recent restoration efforts aim to recover some ecological function in urban streams that were written off as dead for generations. South Mountain extends 75 miles from Pennsylvania through Maryland into Virginia, its quartzite ridge rising 1,000 feet above surrounding valleys, a remnant of ancient seafloor sediments that were buried, compressed, heated, and then uplifted and exposed by erosion over hundreds of millions of years. The mountain is not a single peak, but a continuous ridgeline, remarkably linear, its straightness the result of erosion working on tilted rock layers where resistant quartzite forms the spine and softer rocks erode away on either side. During the Civil War, the mountain became a battlefield, its gaps serving as natural passages through the barrier. And even today, hiking the ridge, you can find stone walls and earthworks built by soldiers who understood that controlling high ground meant controlling movement through the landscape. The mountain creates a rain shadow, with its western slopes receiving slightly more precipitation than its eastern side, and this affects forest composition. Oak and hickory dominate where conditions are drier, while tulip poplar and other moisture-loving species grow where the mountain traps rainfall. From its crest on clear days, you can see both the Great Valley to the west and the Piedmont to the east, two distinct geographical provinces separated by this ridge of resistant stone. The Nanticoke River flows backward during strong storm surges, pushing salt water 30 miles inland from the Chesapeake Bay into normally fresh sections, temporarily transforming the river's chemistry and stressing organisms adapted to freshwater conditions. The river drains the lower eastern shore, flowing through Dorchester and Wicomico counties in a broad valley that was carved when sea levels were lower and the river had more gradient to work with. Now the river is tidal for most of its length, its flow dominated by the twice-daily pulse of the tides rather than by the discharge from its watershed, and during dry periods with spring tides, the river can flow upstream for hours at a time, its surface moving inland, while a layer of denser salt water creeps along the bottom. The storm surge phenomenon is more dramatic, occurring when hurricane winds or nor'easters push bay water up the river, overwhelming the normal tidal cycle and creating what amounts to a temporary flood of salt water that can persist for days until wind and tide combine to flush it back out. Fish and crabs can sense these changes and often move with them, staying in water of their preferred salinity. But rooted aquatic plants have no such option and must endure conditions that can kill them if the intrusion lasts too long. Bear Creek in Garrett County contains water cool enough year-round to support native brook trout populations, fed by springs maintaining 50-degree temperatures even in summer, creating a thermal refuge in a region where most streams warm beyond the tolerance of these cold water specialists. The creek flows through a forested valley where hemlock and rhododendron shade the water, preventing solar heating, and the springs that feed it emerge from groundwater that has been cooled by contact with rock deep beneath the surface. Brook trout require not just cold water, but clean water, high dissolved oxygen and stable flows, and Bear Creek provides all these conditions, making it one of the few Maryland streams where these fish can complete their entire life cycle without needing to migrate to cooler water. The trout themselves are small, rarely exceeding 10 inches, their size limited by the creek's modest productivity, but they're beautifully colored with vermiculated backs and orange bellies edged in white and black, and catching one feels like handling a jewel, something precious and improbable in an era when most streams are too warm or too degraded to support such demanding species. The creek's name is generic, shared by dozens of streams across Appalachia, but this particular Bear Creek matters because it represents what all these mountain streams once were before development warmed them beyond the trout's ability to survive. Kent Island, the Chesapeake Bay's largest island, spans 31 square miles, but rises no more than 50 feet above sea level at its highest point. Its low relief the result of its origin as coastal plain sediments deposited when this area was seafloor. The island isn't really an island anymore, connected to the mainland by bridges that have made it effectively a peninsula, and development has transformed much of its landscape from the farms and fishing villages that characterized it for centuries. Yet the island's geography remains fundamentally shaped by water. The bay surrounds it on three sides. Tidal creeks indent its shoreline, and the water table sits close enough to the surface that basements flood and septic systems struggle. The island's soils are sandy and well-drained in places, heavy clay in others, reflecting the varied depositional environments that created the coastal plain. And this variation affects everything from what crops can grow to where houses can be built. The island was Maryland's first English settlement, predating St. Mary's City by several years, chosen because its location near the bay's mouth made it accessible to ships, while its modest elevation kept it above the highest storm surges. That calculation is being tested now as sea levels rise and storms grow more intense, and the island's future depends on whether engineering can maintain what geography is slowly reclaiming. The Potomac Gorge between Great Falls and Little Falls contains plant species more common 500 miles north, isolated here since the Ice Age in permanently cool microclimates created by the gorge's depth and orientation. The gorge walls rise several hundred feet above the river, blocking direct sunlight for much of the day and creating conditions cooler and moister than the surrounding Piedmont. And in these protected spots grow plants that survived here when glaciers pushed southern forests northward. Species like Canadian yew and painted trillium exist in small populations clinging to the gorge slopes, remnants of a time when such plants were common throughout the region, and their presence demonstrates how local topography can create refugia where species persist long after regional climate has changed. The gorge itself was carved by the Potomac during periods of higher flow, the river cutting down through metamorphic rock and maintaining its course even as base level changed and climate oscillated between glacial and interglacial periods. The rock walls show evidence of this cutting: polish marks where suspended sediment scoured the stone, potholes drilled by swirling water and trapped stones, high water marks indicating flood levels that would be catastrophic today. The gorge represents a kind of time capsule, preserving both geological evidence of past river behavior and biological evidence of past climate conditions. Pocomoke River, flowing through Maryland's lower eastern shore, is considered the deepest river for its width on the East Coast, reaching 45 feet in places despite being barely 100 feet wide, its depth the result of tidal scour cutting into soft coastal plain sediments. The river flows through a landscape so flat that gradient is measured in inches per mile, and the water is stained dark brown by tannic acid leached from cypress swamps and dense vegetation along its banks. The depth creates stratification, with fresh water floating on top of denser salt water that has pushed inland from the bay. And the boundary between these layers, called the halocline, can be surprisingly sharp, visible as a shimmer when you dive beneath it. The river's name comes from a Native American word meaning black water, acknowledging the tannic staining that makes the river's true depth invisible from the surface, and this darkness creates an atmosphere of mystery, the water reflecting sky while hiding everything beneath. The deep channel serves as a migration corridor for fish moving between the bay and spawning grounds upstream, and historically, it was navigable by small ships much farther inland than most eastern shore rivers, making it important for commerce before roads provided alternatives. The Big Savage Tunnel, boring through 3,295 feet of Big Savage Mountain, follows a railroad grade that climbs 2,850 feet in elevation over 17 miles, demonstrating the lengths to which 19th century engineers went to maintain gentle grades for coal trains. The tunnel is now part of a rail trail, and walking or biking through it, you enter complete darkness midway through, the entrances visible as distant circles of light at either end, and the temperature drops noticeably even in summer, the mountain's mass insulating the tunnel from surface heat. The tunnel was dug from both ends simultaneously, the teams meeting in the middle with remarkable accuracy given the surveying technology available, and the bore is straight enough that you can see clear through on rare occasions when conditions allow. The rock being tunneled through is sedimentary, layers of sandstone and shale that compress easily under the mountain's weight, and maintaining the tunnel requires constant monitoring for roof falls and water seepage. The mountain's name, Big Savage, has uncertain origins, but may come from a surveyor named Savage who worked in the area. The Big added to distinguish it from Little Savage Mountain nearby. The tunnel represents ambition and engineering solving problems that geography created, human determination to move through landscape rather than around it. Deal Island Wildlife Management Area protects 12,000 acres of marsh, where Tangier Sound's salinity fluctuates between fresh and brackish, depending on rainfall and tide, creating conditions that support a unique assemblage of species adapted to variable salinity. The marsh here is classic low marsh, dominated by cordgrass in the lower elevations and needlerush higher up. But the influx of fresh water during heavy rains creates patches where plants more typical of freshwater systems can survive. The area serves as critical habitat for waterfowl, particularly black ducks and teal that nest in the marsh and feed in the shallow ponds and guts that thread through the grass. The marsh surface is soft, a floating mat in places where organic matter has accumulated faster than it has decomposed, and walking on it feels precarious, the ground shifting beneath your feet and water seeping up with each step. During king tides or storm surges, the entire marsh can flood, becoming an extension of the sound, and only by looking at the grass bent by current can you tell where channels once defined the boundary between water and land. The marsh is building vertically through organic accumulation and sediment trapping, trying to keep pace with sea level rise. But whether it can succeed depends on whether sediment supply and plant growth can match the rate at which the water is rising. The Potomac River's Mather Gorge averages just 60 feet wide, but plunges to depths of 20 feet, carved through metamorphic rock during periods of higher water flow, when the river carried glacial meltwater from regions hundreds of miles upstream. The gorge is named for the first director of the National Park Service, not for any geological characteristic, though it could as easily be named for the rock, schist, and gneiss that have been compressed and heated deep underground and then exposed by erosion. The walls are nearly vertical in places, polished smooth by millennia of water and sediment, and the constriction creates hydraulics that make the gorge dangerous for paddlers who underestimate the river's power in this narrow section. During floods, the gorge fills completely, the water rising dozens of feet and flowing with enough force to move boulders the size of cars, and the high water marks visible on the rock walls indicate levels that would inundate trails and overlooks now used by thousands of visitors annually. The gorge represents the river at its most concentrated, all its energy focused into a narrow channel where it continues the work of downcutting that has been ongoing since the Potomac established its course millions of years ago. Bloodsworth Island, Maryland's largest uninhabited island, spans 6 square miles in the Chesapeake Bay, but is slowly eroding away at a rate of 20 acres per year, victim to wave action and the lack of sediment input that would replenish what's being lost. The island was inhabited until the 1920s, supporting a community of watermen and farmers who eventually abandoned it as erosion threatened homes and storms made life increasingly precarious. Now, the island is used as a military target range, and unexploded ordnance makes most of it inaccessible. But aerial photos show the erosion clearly. The island is fracturing, breaking into smaller pieces, developing inlets that grow wider each year. The shoreline shows none of the marsh that might buffer wave energy, just low cliffs of sand and clay being undercut by each high tide. The island's soil is pure coastal plain sediment, easily eroded and without the protection that vegetation might provide. Much of the island is kept clear for the target range. There's nothing to slow the process. In another century, Bloodsworth may no longer exist as a single island, but as a collection of shoals and small islets gradually being redistributed across the bay floor, its material spread thin and incorporated into beaches and marshes elsewhere, the island becoming everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The Castleman River flows through an ancient valley in Garrett County. Its path, established before glacial periods, redirected most area drainage patterns, and the valley's broad U-shape suggests it once carried much larger flows, possibly glacial meltwater from ice sheets that advanced south of here. The river today seems undersized for its valley, a modest stream occupying a floodplain wider than necessary, and this disproportion is evidence of changed conditions, of an era when climate delivered more precipitation, or when melting ice provided flows that dwarfed anything the current watershed can generate. The Castleman joins the Youghiogheny River at confluence, aptly named, and together they flow north toward Pennsylvania and eventually the Ohio River system, making the Castleman part of the minority of Maryland streams that drain west toward the Mississippi rather than east toward the Atlantic. The valley is scenic in an understated way, agricultural land giving way to forest on the slopes, the river meandering gently through its oversized bed, and the excess space allows for extensive riparian wetlands that filter runoff and provide habitat for species that need the transition zone between upland and aquatic environments. Hooper Island, actually 3 connected islands, has lost over half its land area in the past century to erosion and subsidence, shrinking from 6,000 acres to fewer than 3,000, with roads and houses that were inland now sitting at the water's edge or already claimed by the bay. The islands, Upper Hooper, Middle Hooper, and Lower Hooper, stretch in a line southward from the eastern shore into the Chesapeake, connected by narrow strips of land and bridges that are themselves threatened by rising water. The communities here are waterman towns, their economies built on crabbing and oystering, and the houses face the water with workboats tied at private docks, everything oriented toward the bay that provides livelihood even as it consumes the land. The erosion is visible everywhere, trees standing in water where shoreline used to be, marsh converted to open bay, roads that end abruptly where pavement has fallen into the water. The islands have no natural high ground to retreat to, no hills or ridges that might provide refuge, and adaptation means accepting loss, moving houses back from advancing shorelines, abandoning properties that become untenable. Some residents have left, the population declining as young people see no future on land that is disappearing, while others stay out of stubbornness or love or lack of alternatives, watching their geography change within a single lifetime. The North Branch Potomac River begins as a spring in West Virginia and flows north before turning southeast through Garrett County, defying the typical drainage pattern and reflecting the complex topography of this region where continental divide snakes through the mountains. The north-flowing section is brief but notable, the river seeming to climb toward Pennsylvania before finding a gap in the ridges and turning toward its eventual destination. This unusual path results from the river's history, its course established when the landscape was configured differently, and the river maintained its route even as uplift and erosion reshaped the mountains around it. The North Branch is dammed to create Jennings-Randolph Lake, and releases from the dam provide flows that support whitewater recreation downstream, a rare case where human manipulation of hydrology has created recreational opportunities that didn't exist when the river flowed naturally. The river corridor is forested and remote in places, the valley steep-sided and the slopes too rugged for development, and this inaccessibility has preserved habitat and water quality that make the North Branch one of Maryland's cleaner streams, despite the coal mining that has impacted headwaters in West Virginia. Elk Neck Peninsula extends 8 miles into the head of the Chesapeake Bay, its clay cliffs eroding to create beaches of mixed sand and shell fragments that accumulate at the peninsula's southern tip. The peninsula is narrow, rarely more than 2 miles wide, with the bay on one side and the Elk River on the other, and this configuration creates the sense of being surrounded by water, of land as interruption rather than water as boundary. The cliffs along the bayside rise 20 to 40 feet, their faces showing horizontal layers of clay and sand deposited when this area was seafloor, and they're actively eroding, slumping during wet periods, and undercut by wave action during storms. The eroded material becomes beach, carried by longshore currents to Turkey Point at the peninsula's tip, where a lighthouse stands on a bluff above water, deep enough that ships can pass close to shore. The peninsula is mostly forested now, protected as a state park, and the forest comes right to the cliff edge in places, trees leaning over the water as erosion removes the soil beneath them. Eventually, each tree falls, contributing woody debris to the beach before being broken up by waves and scattered, the forest slowly following the land as the land retreats before the water. Swallow Falls contains hemlock trees over 300 years old, survivors in a forest where most trees this size vanished to 19th century logging, and these patriarchs stand as testimony to how different Maryland's forests once were. The hemlocks grow in the cool ravine carved by the Youghiogheny River, their presence enabled by the microclimate created by the gorge's depth and the spray from the falls. Hemlock is a northern species, more common in New England and Canada than in Maryland, but these isolated groves persist in places where conditions remain suitable, holdouts in a landscape where climate change has pushed their optimal range northward. The trees are massive, their trunks several feet in diameter, their bark deeply furrowed, their branches creating dense shade that keeps the forest floor relatively open. They grow slowly in this environment, adding perhaps a quarter inch of diameter per year, so their size represents not just age, but centuries of patient accumulation. The hemlocks are threatened now by an invasive insect called the hemlock woolly adelgid, and many of these ancient trees show signs of infestation, their needles thinning and branches dying back. Whether they'll survive another century is uncertain, their persistence no longer dependent on climate and habitat, but on whether treatments can control the insect or whether the trees can develop resistance before the infestation kills them. The Wicomico River on the eastern shore is entirely tidal for its 25-mile length, its flow direction changing 4 times daily with Chesapeake Bay tides, creating a system where upstream and downstream become temporarily meaningless concepts. The river drains a watershed of over 300 square miles, but the gradient is so slight that tidal influence overwhelms freshwater flow except during major rain events. The river's banks are low, lined with marsh that floods with each high tide, and channels branch off the main stem in a dendritic pattern, each tributary also tidal, the entire system pulsing with the bay's rhythm. Salinity varies along the river's length and with depth, fresher water floating atop denser salt water, and this stratification can be surprisingly stable, the layers mixing only during storms or spring tides when turbulence is sufficient to overcome the density difference. The river serves as a highway for fish and crabs, moving between spawning areas and nursery habitat, and historically, it was important for commerce, with towns like Salisbury developing where the river was deep enough for ships, but far enough inland to be protected from bay storms. The river's character is determined entirely by its position in the landscape, too flat to create significant freshwater flow, too close to the bay to avoid tidal influence, making it more estuary than river in function, if not in name. Dan's Mountain in Allegheny County rises to 2,898 feet, its summit offering views across 3 states from a plateau of erosion-resistant sandstone that forms a caprock protecting softer shale beneath. The mountain is part of the Allegheny Front, the escarpment that marks the eastern edge of the Allegheny Plateau, and from its summit the land drops away dramatically to the east, while extending relatively flat to the west. The views are expansive on clear days, the ridges and valleys of the Ridge and Valley Province visible to the east, the plateau extending toward West Virginia to the west. And on exceptional days, you can see the faint blue outline of mountains 50 miles distant. The mountain's summit is accessible by road, a winding climb that gains over 1,000 feet. And at the top, there's a bare rock outcrop called Dan's Rock, where hang gliders launch, trusting their wings and the updrafts created by wind hitting the mountain face. The mountain is named for someone named Dan, his full name lost to history, who may have been a hunter or surveyor, and the possessive form has eroded away, leaving just Dan's, a linguistic weathering parallel to the physical weathering that will eventually reduce this mountain to a hill and then to a barely noticeable rise in the plateau. Taylor's Island projects into the Chesapeake Bay from Dorchester County, surrounded by 10,000 acres of marsh that buffer it from storm waves but not from gradual submergence as sea levels rise and land subsides. The island is connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway that floods during storm tides, temporarily isolating the small community that persists here despite the water's encroachment. The island rises barely 5 feet above sea level at its highest point, and much of it is even lower, making it exquisitely vulnerable to any change in water level or storm intensity. The marsh that surrounds it is deteriorating, converting from productive wetland to open water as sea level rise outpaces the marsh's ability to build vertically. And as the marsh dies, it provides less protection for the island, allowing waves to reach the shore with more energy. The community is small, fewer than 100 residents, and many houses are seasonal now, occupied only during summer when the threat of nor'easters is minimal. The island's future is uncertain, whether to invest in protection that may only delay the inevitable, whether to accept that the island will eventually return to the bay, whether individual property owners will decide independently to stay or leave. The island represents in miniature the choices facing all low-lying coastal communities as the sea refuses to remain at the elevation we've built our infrastructure around. The Potomac River once flowed through Washington, D.C. at a level 200 feet higher than today, carving terraces still visible in Rock Creek Park and other areas where erosion hasn't yet erased these ancient floodplains. These terraces represent periods when the river was cutting laterally rather than vertically, times when base level remained stable long enough for the river to meander across a floodplain at a consistent elevation before renewed downcutting forced it to abandon that level and begin carving a new floodplain lower down. You can see these terraces as step-like features on hillsides, flat benches separated by steeper slopes, each bench a former floodplain now high and dry above the current river. The terraces contain gravels and sands deposited by the ancient river, and occasionally these deposits yield fossils of animals that lived along the Potomac hundreds of thousands of years ago, when the climate oscillated between glacial and interglacial periods. The river's downcutting continues today, though at rates measured in fractions of millimeters per year, imperceptible within a human lifetime, but significant across geological time. The terraces remind us that rivers are not static features but dynamic systems responding to changes in climate, sea level, and tectonic activity, constantly adjusting their profiles to maintain equilibrium between the energy they possess and the work they must do, transporting sediment to the sea. Conowingo Dam on the Susquehanna River traps 2 to 3 million tons of sediment annually, preventing it from reaching the Chesapeake Bay downstream, though the reservoir behind the dam is now nearly full of sediment and the trapping efficiency is declining. The dam was built in the 1920s for hydroelectric power, creating a 14-mile-long reservoir that immediately began filling with sediment washed down from the watershed upstream. For decades, this sediment trapping was seen as beneficial, preventing the bay from becoming clouded with particles eroded from farms and construction sites. But the reservoir's capacity is finite, and sediment continues arriving at rates unchanged by the dam's presence. Now, during major storms, the reservoir fills to capacity, and sediment flows over the spillway, reaching the bay in concentrated pulses that can cloud the water for weeks. The sediment itself is not inherently harmful. Sediment is natural, the material that built the coastal plain and continues building deltas and marshes. But the rate at which it arrives and the nutrients and pollutants it carries create problems for bay ecosystems adapted to clearer water. The dam represents a temporary intervention in the river's natural sediment transport, a delay rather than a solution, and decisions about how to manage the aging structure will affect bay water quality for generations, regardless of which option, dredging, removal, or accepting reduced trapping, is chosen. Assawoman Bay, a shallow coastal lagoon behind Ocean City, averages just 3 feet deep and freezes solid during severe winters, transforming from a navigable waterway into a temporary plain of ice that can support the weight of people walking across it. The bay is separated from the Atlantic by the barrier island on which Ocean City is built, connected to the ocean only through a narrow inlet that was cut artificially in 1933 during a hurricane when the storm breached the barrier island and the breach was maintained for navigation. Before the inlet existed, the bay was even shallower and fresher, more like a marsh pond than a lagoon. But the inlet allows tidal exchange and brings in salt water that has changed the bay's character. The shallowness means the entire water column is well mixed. There's no stratification, no deep layer isolated from surface processes. And this makes the bay highly productive, but also vulnerable to rapid changes in temperature, salinity, and oxygen levels. In summer, the water can become bathtub warm, exceeding 80 degrees, while in winter, it chills quickly when cold air masses settle over the region. The bay's name comes from a Native American word, though its meaning is disputed, and the bay itself supports a modest fishing industry and provides protected water for recreational boating. Its shallowness, a constraint that keeps larger vessels in deeper channels while allowing small boats access to areas inaccessible in rougher water. The Monocacy River Valley follows a synclinal fold, a downward bend in rock layers, making the valley floor underlain by younger rocks than the surrounding ridges, an inversion of the typical relationship where valleys expose older rocks by cutting through younger surface layers. This geological structure results from the intense folding that accompanied the Appalachian mountain building event, when compression forced rock layers to buckle and warp, creating anticlines, upward folds, and synclines, downward folds, that originally stood as ridges and valleys respectively. Over millions of years, erosion reversed the topography, wearing away the anticlines faster because the folding had fractured them and made them more susceptible to weathering, while the synclines, compressed and protected by their downward curvature, eroded more slowly and eventually became the high points. The Monocacy Valley occupies one of these synclinal structures, and drilling deep enough would reveal progressively younger rocks as you go down, the opposite of normal stratigraphy. This structure affects groundwater flow, soil formation, and vegetation patterns in subtle ways that farmers and developers may not recognize, but that influence land use nonetheless. The valley demonstrates that landscape evolution is not simply a matter of rivers cutting down, but involves complex interactions between structure, lithology, and erosional processes operating over timescales so long that mountains can become valleys and valleys can become ridges. Tilghman Island, accessible only by drawbridge, sits barely above sea level in the Chesapeake Bay. Its 800 residents living on land shaped entirely by marine deposits accumulated over thousands of years as rivers brought sediment to the bay. The island is less than 2 miles wide and about 4 miles long, oriented north-south, and every part of it feels close to water. You're never more than a few hundred yards from a shoreline, and the water is visible from most properties. The island has the character of a working waterfront, with crab houses and boat repair yards and docks extending into the water where skipjacks and dead-rise workboats tie up, their presence evidence of a commercial fishing culture that has persisted here for generations. The drawbridge that connects the island to the mainland opens on a schedule to allow sailboats with tall masts to pass, and during these openings, traffic backs up on both sides, cars and trucks waiting while boats navigate the narrow channel. The island's vulnerability to sea level rise is obvious. Many roads flood during spring tides, and storm surges can inundate entire neighborhoods. But the community persists, adapting through elevation of houses, acceptance of periodic flooding, and a collective decision that the benefits of island life outweigh the costs of its precarious geography. The island represents a choice to live with water rather than defend against it, to accept impermanence and adaptation as conditions of residence. Negro Mountain, at 3,213 feet, Maryland's second highest peak, forms part of the Eastern Continental Divide, where rain, falling on one side, flows to the Atlantic and the other toward the Gulf of Mexico via the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. The divide is not a dramatic ridge, but a subtle watershed boundary, often crossing relatively flat terrain on the mountain's summit, where the direction water flows is determined by differences in elevation measured in inches. Standing on the divide, you can pour water that will split and flow in opposite directions, ultimately reaching oceans separated by the entire breadth of North America. The mountain's name has controversial origins, most likely referring to a free black man who died fighting Native Americans alongside white settlers in the 18th century, and there have been periodic efforts to rename it, though the name persists on maps and in local usage. The mountain is forested, mostly red spruce and northern hardwoods, with some of the highest elevation forest in Maryland, and the summit area contains wetlands and seeps where water collects before beginning its journey to one coast or the other. The divide's location here is not arbitrary, but reflects the ancient structure of the Appalachians, with the Allegheny Front forming a natural barrier that diverts drainage either east toward the Atlantic or west toward the interior lowlands. The Potomac River's Little Falls drops 40 feet over a distance of 1,000 feet, marking the absolute head of tidewater where ocean influence ends and the river transitions from an estuary to a flowing stream. Below Little Falls, the river is affected by tides that push upstream twice daily, creating slack water periods when the current pauses or reverses. While above the falls, the river flows continuously downhill, unaffected by the moon's pull. The falls themselves are not particularly dramatic, more a series of rapids than a true waterfall. but the drop is sufficient to prevent ships from passing. And this geographic fact determined that Georgetown would be the head of navigation on the Potomac, the furthest upstream that ocean-going vessels could reach. The falls also mark a change in geology, with resistant metamorphic rock creating the rapids, while softer coastal plain sediments downstream allow the river to widen and slow. The sound of the falls is constant, a white noise that masks the traffic from nearby parkways and creates the illusion of remoteness despite the urban context. During low water, you can see the rock formations clearly, the water braiding around boulders and ledges, while during floods, the falls disappear entirely beneath a brown torrent that submerges the rapids and converts the entire reach into a single hydraulic. Pickering Creek on the eastern shore drains into the Chesapeake Bay through a network of tidal guts, narrow channels that fill and empty twice daily, creating a maze of waterways through the marsh that separates upland from open bay. The guts are shallow, often just a few feet deep, but they carry significant volumes of water as the tide floods and ebbs, and navigating them requires local knowledge of which channels are passable and which dead end in marsh. The creek itself is modest, draining a small watershed of farms and forest, but its mouth is disproportionately large, a drowned valley flooded by post-glacial sea level rise and converted into an estuary where fresh and salt water mix in proportions that vary with tide and season. The tidal guts serve as nursery habitat for young fish and crabs that need the shallow, warm water and the protection from predators that the complex channel network provides, and they also buffer the upland from storm waves, dissipating energy as water flows through the constricted passages. The landscape here is transitional in every sense, between land and water, fresh and salt, stable and dynamic, and the guts themselves appear and disappear with the tide, existing as waterways only during high water and becoming mudflats during the lowest tides, when the bay retreats and exposes the marsh surface. Allegheny Front rises as an escarpment marking the Appalachian Plateau's eastern edge, where the land surface drops 1,500 feet in a single steep slope that defines the boundary between plateau and ridge and valley province. The front is not a single cliff, but a zone where resistant sandstone layers create a steep face that erosion has barely modified over millions of years. The escarpment extends from New York through Pennsylvania and into Maryland, and from its crest, you can see the ridge and valley topography stretching east, parallel ridges separated by long, straight valleys, the result of erosion working on folded rocks of varying resistance. The front's existence reflects differential erosion. The plateau surface is underlain by resistant rocks that erode slowly, while the ridge and valley rocks, though also resistant in places, have been more extensively dissected by streams that exploited weaknesses in the folded structure. The climate differs noticeably from one side of the front to the other, with the plateau receiving more precipitation and experiencing harsher winters due to its elevation and exposure to prevailing winds. The front has served as a natural barrier throughout history, impeding westward movement and channeling traffic through gaps and low passes where roads and railroads could negotiate the elevation change without impossible grades. Poplar Island in the Chesapeake Bay disappeared entirely beneath the waves by the 1990s, but is being reconstructed using dredged material from Baltimore Harbor shipping channels, transforming what was open water back into island through an engineering project that may preview how coastal communities will have to actively rebuild land as sea level rises. The original island was substantial, over 1,000 acres, and supported farms and a small community until erosion and subsidence reduced it to marsh then to shoals, then to nothing but underwater memory. The reconstruction involves creating containment structures, perimeter dikes, and filling them with sediment dredged from shipping channels that must be maintained at specific depths for commercial traffic. The dredged material is mostly silt and clay, exactly what the original island was made of, and as it's placed and settles, it creates new land at approximately the elevation the original island occupied. The reconstructed island is being designed as wildlife habitat, with specific attention to creating conditions suitable for nesting birds, particularly terns and black skimmers that need isolated islands free from mammalian predators. The project demonstrates that land loss is not necessarily permanent, that with sufficient resources and political will, geography can be renegotiated, though whether such reconstruction can be sustained indefinitely as sea levels continue rising remains an open question. Poplar Island represents both technological capability and ecological humility, an acknowledgement that we can rebuild land while recognizing that the forces destroying it operate on scales that may ultimately exceed our capacity to resist. The Savage River, Maryland's premier trout stream, maintains temperatures below 65 degrees, even in August, through releases from a deep reservoir upstream where water is drawn from depths where it remains cold year-round, creating artificial but effective thermal refuge for fish that would otherwise suffer in warmed summer flows. The river flows through a narrow forested valley in Garrett County, its water clear and its gradient moderate, creating the classic pocket water and riffles that trout fishermen seek. The cold water is supplemented by natural springs along the river's course, and the combination of temperature, oxygen levels, and habitat structure supports both stocked and wild trout, with some fish reaching impressive sizes for a Maryland stream. The river's name, Savage, may derive from the same surveyor who named the mountains, or it may simply describe the river's character during floods when it becomes something fierce and dangerous, transforming from a stream you can wade across to a torrent that moves boulders and scours its channel down to bedrock. The temperature control provided by the reservoir is artificial but effective, demonstrating that human intervention in hydrology can sometimes benefit ecosystems if designed with ecological goals in mind, though it also represents a commitment to ongoing management, as the temperature regime depends on continued dam operation and controlled releases that mimic, but don't replicate, natural seasonal patterns. Sharps Island, once a 700-acre farming community in the Chesapeake Bay, has eroded to a single acre, marked only by a leaning lighthouse surrounded by water, the island's soil redistributed across the bay floor, and its human history reduced to ruins occasionally exposed at low tide. The island was inhabited until the early 20th century, supporting farms that produced grain and vegetables for Baltimore markets, but erosion accelerated after a hotel built on the island burned down, and the protective measures around it were abandoned. The lighthouse, built in 1882, originally stood well inland, but now sits in water, and it leans at a dramatic angle, comparable to the Leaning Tower of Pisa, because its foundation shifted as the island beneath it eroded away. The lighthouse still operates, its automated light warning ships of the shoal, though the structure itself seems increasingly improbable, a vertical element in a horizontal seascape. At low tide, you can see remnants of the island's past, foundation stones, pieces of brick, occasionally bottles or pottery, emerging briefly before the next tide covers them again. The island's disappearance illustrates how vulnerable Chesapeake Bay islands are to erosion, especially those composed of easily eroded sediments without the protection of marsh or forest, and it previews what may happen to other bay islands as sea level rise accelerates and wave energy increases. The The Potomac River forms meanders near Point of Rocks, where it crosses easily eroded shale, creating curves that grow more pronounced each year as the river cuts into the outside banks of bends and deposits sediment on the inside banks, gradually shifting its channel laterally across the floodplain. The meanders are visible from satellite imagery, the river appearing as a sinuous line threading through the valley, and over time these curves can become so pronounced that the river cuts through the narrow neck of land separating one bend from the next, creating an oxbow lake where the old channel is abandoned and gradually fills with sediment. The shale underlying this section of the river is soft compared to the crystalline rocks upstream and the coastal plain sediments downstream, and this softness allows the river freedom to meander in ways it cannot where confined by more resistant rock. The Point of Rocks itself is an outcrop of harder quartzite that the river must flow around, creating a natural landmark and a slight narrowing of the channel. And historically, this was a fording site where the river could be crossed more safely than in deeper sections upstream or downstream. The meanders demonstrate that rivers are not static lines on maps, but dynamic systems constantly reshaping their channels in response to flow, sediment load, and the resistance of the material they're cutting through. Money Bay in Somerset County contains submerged archaeological sites where 18th century farms now lie beneath 3 feet of water due to land subsidence. Their locations marked on old maps but invisible from the surface, except during the lowest tides when foundation stones might briefly appear. The bay is shallow and brackish, surrounded by marsh, and it represents the meeting point of several tidal creeks that drain the low-lying interior of the eastern shore. The subsidence here is the same process affecting the entire Delmarva Peninsula, the slow settling of land that was uplifted during the Ice Age. But local factors like groundwater withdrawal and compaction of organic-rich sediments may accelerate the process in places. The submerged farms are evidence of how recently this land was above water, how quickly relative sea level can change when subsidence and rising water combine, and they serve as a warning about what might happen to current farmland and communities if trends continue. Occasionally, storms or unusual tides shift enough sediment to expose artifacts, pieces of pottery, bricks, metal tools, that wash onto nearby beaches where they're found by people who may not realize they're handling objects from places that no longer exist above water. The bay's underwater landscape is a palimpsest, layers of human occupation buried beneath layers of sediment and water, and what was once cultivated is now habitat for fish and crabs that navigate among ruins they don't recognize as such. Wills Mountain extends from Pennsylvania into Maryland as a resistant sandstone ridge rising 1,000 feet above the adjacent valley floor, its linear form and steep sides the result of erosion working on tilted rock layers, where hard sandstone protects softer shale on either side. The mountain is part of the Ridge and Valley Province, that distinctive Appalachian landscape where parallel ridges alternate with valleys in a pattern so regular it's visible from space. Wills Mountain's formation involves both the original folding of rocks during mountain building and the subsequent millions of years of erosion that stripped away softer layers and isolated the resistant ones as ridges. The name comes from a colonial surveyor or trader named Wills, whose exact identity is lost, but whose name persists on this geographic feature he probably never climbed, but perhaps used as a landmark. The mountain creates a barrier to east-west travel, and roads that cross it must either navigate switchbacks up the steep slopes or go through gaps where streams have cut through the ridge. The mountain's crest supports forest dominated by oak and hickory on its drier south-facing slopes and mixed hardwoods on its moister north-facing slopes. And this aspect-related difference in vegetation is subtle but consistent, determined by the few degrees of temperature difference and the variation in soil moisture that orientation toward the sun creates. The Chesapeake Bay's deepest point lies off Bloody Point on Kent Island, where a scoured channel reaches 174 feet below sea level, carved by tidal currents concentrated in the narrow passage between the island and the eastern shore. This depth is anomalous in a bay that averages just 21 feet, a local feature rather than a characteristic one, and it was created by the acceleration of water forced through a constriction during each tidal cycle. The channel is relatively narrow, perhaps a few hundred feet wide, and it serves as a migration route for fish moving between the bay's upper and lower reaches, the depth providing cooler water and protection from predators that patrol shallower areas. The name Bloody Point has uncertain origins, possibly referring to a colonial-era massacre, possibly to red-colored soil, possibly to something else entirely lost to history. But the point itself is a significant landmark for navigation, marking the eastern edge of the shipping channel that connects Baltimore to the bay's mouth. The deep channel represents the bay's dynamism, its ability to scour and deposit and redistribute sediment according to patterns of current that have been operating since the bay formed. In most of the bay you can see the bottom, but here the water is dark and impenetrable, hiding depths that rival some coastal waters and creating habitat for species that need the pressure and darkness that depth provides. Jennings Run in Garrett County flows through a gorge carved when glacial meltwater volumes were 10 times current flows, leaving an oversized valley that testifies to past climatic conditions radically different from the present. The gorge is steep-sided and narrow, with the creek occupying only a fraction of the valley floor it once filled, and the walls show evidence of the erosive power that carved them. Polished rock surfaces, undercut banks, boulders deposited far above the current high water mark. During the Pleistocene, when continental ice sheets advanced south of here, meltwater from their edges created flows of immense volume, and streams like Jennings Run carried this water toward the larger river systems, their channels swollen and turbulent. As climate warmed and the ice retreated, flows diminished and the creeks shrank, leaving valleys too large for the streams now occupying them. The mismatch between stream size and valley size is evidence readable in the landscape, a record of climate history as clear as tree rings or ice cores, and it demonstrates that current conditions are not representative of the full range of conditions this landscape has experienced. The gorge is beautiful in its way, shaded by hemlocks that find the cool, moist microclimate suitable, the creek visible far below as a ribbon of white water tumbling over rocks, and walking along its rim, you can imagine the torrent that carved it, the roar that must have filled the valley when water volumes peaked during spring melts thousands of years ago. South River near Annapolis floods with storm surge during nor'easters, pushing water 2 to 3 feet above normal high tide into streets built at sea level, temporarily converting roads into canals and forcing residents to evacuate or accept inundation. The river is tidal throughout its length, really an extension of the Chesapeake Bay, and its mouth is wide and shallow, characteristics that make it vulnerable to surge when storms pile water against the shore. The flooding is predictable but difficult to prevent. Raising every street and house would be prohibitively expensive, and barriers that might protect against surge would cut off water access that gives the area much of its value. The community has adapted through flood insurance, elevation of utilities, acceptance that certain storm events will bring water into buildings, and emergency plans that activate when forecasts predict significant surge. The flooding is temporary, usually lasting just hours while the storm persists and water remains elevated. And once winds shift and pressure systems move on, the water drains back into the river and bay, leaving behind only watermarks and debris. The river's susceptibility to surge is increasing as sea level rises. What once required a major storm now happens during moderate events, and what used to be nuisance flooding is becoming damaging flooding. And this acceleration of impacts forces communities to reconsider land use patterns and development policies that assumed water would stay within historical bounds. Green Ridge State Forest protects 44,000 acres of parallel mountain ridges in Allegheny County, each ridge aligned northeast-southwest from ancient tectonic folding, creating a landscape of repeating patterns where topography reflects the underlying geological structure. The ridges are similar in height and spacing, separated by narrow valleys where streams have exploited zones of weakness in the folded rocks. And from above, the forest appears as a series of parallel waves frozen in stone. The forest is mostly oak and hickory on the ridges, with pine and hemlock in the moister valley bottoms, and this vegetation pattern mirrors the moisture gradient created by topography. Ridges dry out quickly, while valleys retain water. The forest is crisscrossed by dirt roads and trails that follow both ridges and valleys, and hiking here involves constant climbing and descending as you cross from one watershed to the next. The area was logged extensively in the past, and the current forest is mostly second growth, but it's been recovering for decades, and in places, it's difficult to see evidence of the cutting that once removed nearly every marketable tree. The parallel ridges create barriers to east-west movement, and historically travel through this area followed valleys where terrain was gentler, a pattern still visible in the routes of roads and railroads that snake through the mountains following the path of least resistance. Hart Miller Island in the Chesapeake Bay grew from 40 acres to 1,100 acres between 1981 and 2009 as dredged material from Baltimore Harbor was deposited there, transforming what was a modest natural island into an engineered landform, serving as both disposal site and demonstration that land creation is possible even as other islands erode away. The island now consists of containment cells surrounded by dikes, each cell filled with sediment until it reaches the desired elevation, then capped and allowed to vegetate naturally or planted with native species to accelerate ecological succession. The dredged material is mostly fine sediment, silt and clay, eroded from the Susquehanna watershed and deposited in Baltimore Harbor, where it must be removed to maintain navigation channels at depths sufficient for commercial shipping. Rather than disposing of this material in deep water where it would be lost to the system, the Hart Miller project captures it and converts it into habitat, creating conditions suitable for nesting birds and eventually for marsh plants as the cells stabilize. The island demonstrates that the same processes destroying other islands, erosion, subsidence, sea level rise, can be countered through deliberate intervention, though whether such projects are economically sustainable at the scale necessary to offset regional land loss remains uncertain. The island is closed to public access during nesting season, and from a distance it appears natural despite its artificial origin, the vegetation covering the dikes and the birds using it apparently indifferent to whether the land formed through geological or engineering processes. The Patapsco River's middle branch once flowed through tidal marshes that are now buried beneath 30 feet of fill, supporting Baltimore's industrial waterfront. The marsh's existence recorded only in old maps and soil borings that penetrate the fill and encounter organic rich sediments characteristic of wetland environments. The fill was placed gradually over more than a century as the city's port expanded and industry demanded flat land near deep water, and each layer of fill raised the surface elevation and pushed the shoreline further into the river. The buried marsh still affects the area. Buildings constructed on fill can settle unevenly as the organic material beneath compresses, and groundwater flowing through the old marsh sediments can be contaminated by industrial activities that occurred on the surface decades ago. The middle branch itself is now entirely channelized, confined between bulkheads and maintained at depths sufficient for ships, its tidal marshes and natural shoreline replaced by infrastructure. Yet the river persists, still tidal, still rising and falling with the bay's rhythm, still capable of flooding during storm surge, though now the flooding threatens warehouses and highways rather than marsh plants and wading birds. The transformation illustrates how thoroughly humans have rearranged geography in service of commerce, converting dynamic tidal wetlands into static industrial land, though the hydrological connections remain and the water still flows through the system, even if its pathway and character have been fundamentally altered. Fishing Bay on the eastern shore contains channels 40 feet deep carved by tidal currents, moving between the Nanticoke River and the Chesapeake Bay, creating passages where water velocity increases and the flow concentrates enough energy to scour the bottom down to consolidated sediments that resist further erosion. The bay is otherwise shallow, averaging 6 to 8 feet, making these channels significant features in the underwater topography and important navigation routes for boats that would ground on the surrounding shoals. The channels shift subtly over time as currents change with variations in river discharge and bay water levels, and what was navigable one decade might shoal up the next as sediment deposition outpaces scour. The deep water in the channels provides habitat for species that need cooler temperatures or higher salinities than the shallow bay offers, creating ecological niches within the larger bay system. The channels also affect mixing, allowing denser salt water from the bay to penetrate inland along the bottom, while fresher water from the Nanticoke flows seaward at the surface, creating stratification that influences oxygen distribution and nutrient cycling. Fishing Bay's name is literal. The area supports commercial and recreational fishing, and the productivity results partly from these channels that connect different water masses and allow fish to move between spawning areas and feeding grounds. The bay represents the complexity hidden beneath apparently simple shallow water systems, where subtle variations in depth and current create habitats as varied as any terrestrial landscape. Town Hill in Allegheny County rises to 1,880 feet, its quartzite caprock creating cliffs visible from Interstate 68, where the road cuts through the ridge, exposing the mountain's internal structure and revealing the tilted sedimentary layers that were compressed and hardened during mountain building events hundreds of millions of years ago. The cut is dramatic, several hundred feet of rock face rising directly from the highway, and the layers are visible as parallel bands of varying color and texture: tan sandstone, gray shale, rusty-colored mudstone, each representing a different depositional environment from an ancient ocean or river delta. The quartzite at the top is the most resistant, creating the summit cliffs and protecting softer rocks beneath from erosion, and this differential weathering maintains the ridge's height, while valleys on either side erode down to softer formations. The mountain's name is prosaic, simply acknowledging the town of Little Orleans at its base, but the feature itself represents deep time and the patient work of geological forces that folded flat-lying sediments into mountains and then exposed them through erosion. Driving through the cut is a brief journey through time, each layer you pass representing thousands or millions of years of accumulation, and the entire sequence revealing conditions that existed when this region was submerged beneath tropical seas, where sediments accumulated grain by grain in deltas and lagoons that no longer exist, except as rock. Holland Island, once home to 360 residents, has eroded to nearly nothing since the 1900s, with its last house collapsing into the Chesapeake Bay in 2010, captured in photographs that circulated widely as a symbol of climate change and coastal vulnerability. The island supported a complete community: houses, churches, stores, a post office, and the residents made their living from the bay, oystering and crabbing from boats tied at private docks. The erosion began gradually, barely noticeable at first, but accelerated as marsh buffer disappeared and waves could attack the shore directly. Undercut banks collapsed, and land that had seemed permanent proved temporary. Residents abandoned the island in stages, some leaving in the 1920s as erosion threatened their properties, others staying until the 1940s, when the last services closed and maintaining homes became untenable. The last house stood alone for decades, gradually undermined by waves, its porches collapsing, its walls leaning, until finally the entire structure fell into the water during a storm, leaving only pilings and foundation stones to mark where the community existed. The island's disappearance is complete enough that visitors approaching by boat might not realize land was ever here, that people lived full lives on soil that is now beneath several feet of water, that what seems like natural bay was within living memory, someone's home. Holland Island represents not just erosion, but the impermanence of human occupation in landscapes where natural processes operate at scales indifferent to our presence. The West Branch. Herring Run in Baltimore flows entirely underground through storm drains, buried beneath city streets in the 1940s, when urban planners decided that channelized streams were more efficient than natural waterways and that covering them would free surface land for development. The stream still exists, still collects runoff from its watershed, still flows downhill toward the Patapsco River, but it does so invisibly, its water confined in concrete pipes that follow the route the natural channel once took. The burial eliminated the stream's ecological function. No fish can live in a pipe, no riparian vegetation can grow, no floodplain can absorb high flows, and converted the waterway into pure infrastructure, valued only for its capacity to move stormwater. The stream emerges briefly at its mouth before entering the river, a concrete outfall where water pours out during rains, often carrying trash and pollutants that accumulated in the system. There are occasional discussions of daylighting the stream, removing the pavement and recreating a surface channel, but the cost and disruption make such projects challenging in fully developed urban areas. The West Branch Herring Run represents a common fate for urban streams, their names persisting on maps long after their physical form has been erased, their presence reduced to problems with stormwater management and basement flooding when the pipes prove inadequate during extreme rainfall events that exceed the system's design capacity. Eastern Neck Island, where the Chester River meets the Chesapeake Bay, hosts a wildlife refuge across 2,285 acres of mixed forest and marsh, protecting habitat for waterfowl and shorebirds that use the island during migration or for nesting. The island is accessible by bridge, but maintains a rural character, with more land in conservation than development, and the refugee trails offer views across marsh and water to horizons unobstructed by buildings. The island sits low in the water, rising barely 20 feet at its highest point, and storm surges regularly flood the lower elevations, temporarily converting trails to streams and creating ephemeral ponds in depressions that drain slowly as water recedes. The marsh that surrounds much of the island is dying back in places as sea level rise outpaces the marsh's ability to build elevation through organic accumulation, and the transition from vegetated marsh to open water is visible as a ragged edge where plants give way to mud and then to shallow bay. The island demonstrates the challenges facing refugees established to protect specific habitats when those habitats are themselves unstable due to changing environmental conditions. The birds still come, geese by the thousands in winter, terns and plovers in summer, but whether the island can continue providing suitable habitat as its geography changes remains uncertain. The refugee represents an attempt to preserve what exists, even as the forces shaping it continue operating, a static designation applied to a dynamic landscape. Meadow Mountain in Garrett County contains sinkholes where slightly acidic groundwater has dissolved underground limestone, creating depressions 30 feet deep that appear suddenly in the forest floor, as if the earth has exhaled and left hollows behind. The sinkholes form when rainwater, made slightly acidic by carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and organic acids from decaying vegetation, percolates through soil and encounters limestone, dissolving the calcium carbonate and carrying it away in solution. Over time, underground voids develop, and eventually the overlying rock and soil collapse into these voids, creating surface depressions that range from small pits to substantial craters. The sinkholes collect water during rains, becoming temporary ponds, but most drain through openings at their bottoms into underground streams that flow through cave systems hidden beneath the mountain. Walking the mountain, you encounter these depressions without warning, the ground dropping away suddenly, and peering into them reveals dark openings where water disappears underground, heading toward destinations unknown. Some sinkholes are recent, their edges still raw, and their bottoms littered with freshly fallen trees, while others are ancient, their slopes gentled by erosion, and their bottoms filled with accumulated organic matter. The sinkholes demonstrate that landscape evolution occurs not just through surface processes, but through subsurface dissolution, that mountains are being removed, not just by streams carrying sediment away, but by water dissolving them from within and transporting them invisibly as dissolved minerals. The Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, though primarily in Virginia, begins in Somerset County, where U.S. Route 13 crosses shallow tidal flats on elevated roadway before descending to water level and continuing south as a combination of bridges and tunnels that avoid shipping channels. The Maryland approach crosses marshes and mud flats that flood at high tide, the road supported on pilings driven deep into soft sediments, and from the roadway, you can see for miles across flat wetlands broken only by channels and occasional hammocks of slightly higher ground. The route demonstrates the engineering required to cross a landscape that is neither fully land nor fully water, where building on the surface is impossible, and the only options are to bridge over or tunnel under. The marshes here are extensive, thousands of acres of grass and mud that serve as nursery habitat for fish and crabs and as feeding grounds for wading birds, and the elevated roadway has minimal impact on the marsh function because it allows tidal flow beneath the structure. The approach represents the transition from Maryland's eastern shore to the Delmarva Peninsula's southern reach, where land gives way to water gradually, and the boundary between states becomes as ambiguous as the boundary between marsh and bay. Gwynns Falls in Baltimore drops 300 feet from its source to the Patapsco River, its original natural waterfalls now hidden beneath city infrastructure, culverts and storm drains, and channelized sections where the stream was straightened and confined between concrete walls to prevent flooding and free land for development. The stream drains a substantial urban watershed, and its water quality reflects everything that happens on those impervious surfaces: oil and heavy metals from roads, nutrients from lawns, bacteria from failing septic systems and sewer overflows. Despite degradation, the stream persists, still flowing, still responding to rainfall by rising and falling, and recent restoration efforts have created sections where the concrete has been removed and the stream allowed to flow through naturalized channels with vegetation on the banks and structures that create pools and riffles. These restored sections demonstrate that urban streams can recover ecological function if given the opportunity, though full recovery is impossible as long as the watershed remains heavily developed and stormwater continues flowing directly into the stream without treatment. The falls themselves, the natural drops that gave the stream its character, are mostly forgotten now, known only through historical accounts and occasional glimpses where rock outcrops still create small cascades in parks. The stream's history is typical of urban waterways, valued initially for power and water supply, then seen as nuisances to be controlled and hidden, and recently reconsidered as amenities worth protecting and restoring. Tuckahoe Creek on the eastern shore flows through a cypress swamp, one of the northernmost stands of bald cypress trees on the Atlantic coast. Their presence here, a legacy of warmer periods when these southern species extended their range northward and established populations that have persisted in protected sites. The swamp is dim and quiet, the water dark with tannins, the cypress trees rising from the water on buttressed trunks that spread wide at the base to provide stability in the soft, wet soil. The trees are deciduous conifers, an unusual combination, and they drop their needles each fall, giving the swamp a skeletal appearance in winter when the bare trunks and branches stand reflected in black water. The swamp floods regularly, the water level rising and falling with rainfall and snowmelt, and during high water, you can paddle through the forest, navigating between trees, the canoe gliding over submerged roots and fallen logs. The creek itself is barely visible in the swamp, its channel defined only by slightly deeper water and stronger current, and it flows so slowly that determining direction of flow requires watching leaves or sticks drift gradually downstream. The swamp serves multiple functions: flood storage, water quality improvement, habitat, and it represents a rare ecosystem type on the eastern shore where most wetlands are tidal marshes rather than freshwater swamps. The cypress trees are near the northern limit of their range here, and climate change may determine whether they persist or expand further north as conditions warm. Polish Mountain in Allegheny County reaches 2,782 feet, despite its name having nothing to do with Poland, but rather an 18th century surveyor's notation whose meaning has been lost or corrupted over generations of map-making. The mountain is part of the Ridge and Valley system, its formation and erosion following the same patterns as neighboring ridges, and nothing about its geology or ecology distinguishes it except the quirk of nomenclature that attached this particular name to this particular ridge. The summit is forested, accessible by trails that climb through oak and hickory to the crest, where views open across parallel valleys and ridges extending to the horizon. The mountain creates a rain shadow effect, its western slopes receiving more precipitation than its eastern slopes, and this affects vegetation in subtle ways that would go unnoticed except by careful observation. The name illustrates how geography accumulates labels that persist even when their origins are forgotten, how features become known by designations that may have been arbitrary or mistaken from the beginning, and how attempts to correct or clarify names often fail because the existing name has become embedded in local usage and official maps. The mountain doesn't care what it's called. It erodes at the same rate regardless, its rocks responding to weathering and its forests succeeding according to ecological principles indifferent to human naming conventions. The The Susquehanna River delivers 19 million tons of sediment to the Chesapeake Bay annually, though dams now trap 80% of historical sediment loads, reducing the amount reaching the bay and affecting processes that depend on sediment delivery. Delta building, marsh accretion, beach nourishment. The sediment comes from throughout the river's vast watershed, which extends north into New York and west into Pennsylvania, collecting material eroded from farms, construction sites, stream banks, and naturally eroding landscapes. The reduction in sediment delivery has multiple effects. It reduces water cloudiness in the bay, which benefits submerged aquatic vegetation that needs clear water for photosynthesis. But it also starves marshes and beaches of the material they need to build elevation and maintain themselves against sea level rise. The sediment trapped behind dams accumulates in reservoirs, reducing their capacity and creating management challenges as the storage space fills. The Susquehanna's role as the bay's primary sediment source means that what happens in its watershed affects the entire bay system, and the dams on the river represent a fundamental alteration of the bay's sediment budget. The river still flows, still delivers water and nutrients and some sediment, but the balance has shifted and the bay is adjusting to conditions different from those that shaped it over the past 10,000 years, adapting to an era of reduced sediment delivery that may be temporary if dams are removed or permanent if they persist, and sediment is diverted elsewhere. Solomon's Island, where the Patuxent River meets the Chesapeake Bay, sits on a spit of land built entirely from sediments washed down the river over millennia and deposited where the current slows upon entering the bay's wider waters. The island isn't really an island anymore, connected to the mainland by a narrow neck of land, and it functions as a small town, oriented entirely toward the water, with marinas and seafood restaurants and boats visible from every street. The spit continues building, growing slowly southward as the river continues delivering sediment. Though human structures now constrain the process and the natural evolution of the shoreline has been interrupted by bulkheads and jetties, the island's name honors a 19th century entrepreneur who built a seafood packing plant here, recognizing the strategic location where fishing boats could access both the river and the bay. The water around the island ranges from fresh to brackish, the salinity varying with river discharge and tidal stage, and this mixing zone supports diverse fish populations that use the area as a nursery or feeding ground. The island demonstrates how rivers build land at their mouths through steady deposition of sediment, a process that has created deltas and spits and barrier islands throughout the Chesapeake system, though whether this building can continue as sea levels rise and sediment delivery decreases remains an open question. Dan's Rock, a quartzite outcrop on Dan's Mountain, offers views extending 50 miles on clear days from its 2,900-foot elevation, the exposed rock providing a platform above the forest canopy where the full sweep of the mountain landscape becomes visible. The rock itself is weathered and fractured, broken into blocks by freeze-thaw cycles and chemical weathering that slowly breaks down even resistant quartzite, and the cracks support specialized plants that can tolerate the extreme conditions, temperature fluctuations, drought, exposure to wind, that characterize exposed summits. The outcrop is popular with hang gliders who launch from the rock face, trusting the updrafts created when prevailing winds hit the mountain and are deflected upward. And on weekends, you can watch colorful wings circling above the valley, pilots reading the invisible air currents and riding them for hours. The views from the rock encompass both plateau and ridge and valley landscapes, illustrating the abrupt transition at the Allegheny front, where one geological province gives way to another. The rock represents a moment of geological permanence in a landscape that is overall eroding, a resistant remnant that will persist long after softer rocks around it have been carried away by streams, though eventually even quartzite succumbs, and the rock will be reduced to sand grains that will wash downslope and begin their own journey toward the sea. The Magathi River near Annapolis reaches depths of 42 feet in its main channel, despite appearing shallow, its depth hidden by turbid water that carries sediment suspended by tidal currents and boat traffic. The river is really an estuary, tidal throughout its length, and it branches into multiple arms and coves that create complex shoreline and diverse habitat. The deep channel serves as a migration route and refuge where fish can access cooler water during summer, and where predators and prey play out ancient relationships in water too murky for human observation. The river's watershed is heavily developed, and runoff carries nutrients and sediments that contribute to the turbidity and occasional algae blooms, though recent restoration efforts have created buffer zones and wetlands that filter runoff before it reaches the water. The river's depth affects boat navigation, allowing larger vessels to navigate the main channel while restricting access to shallow coves and tributaries where depths at low tide can be measured in inches. The river demonstrates that estuaries are more complex than they appear from the surface, that underwater topography creates three-dimensional habitat as varied as terrestrial landscapes, and that managing these systems requires understanding not just surface conditions, but the depths and channels and shoals that structure ecological processes beneath the water. Martin Mountain in Garrett County forms part of the Allegheny Plateau, where near horizontal rock layers create a landscape of flat-topped ridges rather than the folded ridges of the Ridge and Valley Province visible to the east. The plateau represents a different geological history, one where sedimentary rocks were deposited horizontally and remained largely undisturbed by the intense folding that affected areas further east during mountain building. The result is topography controlled by differential erosion rather than structure. Streams cut down through horizontal layers, and where they encounter resistant sandstone layers, they create benches and waterfalls, while softer shale layers erode into valleys. The mountain's summit is relatively flat, true to the plateau character, and the forests here are northern hardwoods mixed with spruce in wetter areas, the species composition reflecting the elevation and the cool temperatures that persist even in summer. The plateau as a whole tilts gently westward, draining toward the Ohio River system rather than the Atlantic. And this orientation has isolated the region somewhat from the population centers on the coastal plain, preserving a rural character and extensive forests that have become valuable for recreation and conservation as development pressures increase elsewhere. Breton Bay on the Potomac River contains eelgrass beds recovering from pollution, their presence indicating improved water clarity after decades of degradation, when nutrients and sediments clouded the water and prevented the light penetration that eelgrass requires for photosynthesis. The recovery is tentative, with beds expanding in some years and contracting in others depending on weather patterns and nutrient loads. But the overall trend is positive, and the grass now covers areas where it had disappeared completely. Eelgrass provides critical habitat. Its blades shelter juvenile fish and crabs. Its roots stabilize sediment. Its presence indicates environmental conditions suitable for many species, and its return signals that restoration efforts are having measurable effects. The bay is shallow, averaging 6 to 8 feet, and the eelgrass grows in depths where light can reach the bottom, creating underwater meadows visible from boats as dark patches in otherwise uniform sandy bottoms. The grass reproduces both vegetatively through spreading rhizomes and sexually through seeds, and once established, it can expand quickly if conditions remain favorable, though it's vulnerable to sudden setbacks from storms that reduce water clarity or disease outbreaks that kill patches of established grass. The recovery of eelgrass in Breton Bay and elsewhere in the Chesapeake system represents hope that ecosystems can respond positively to improved management, though maintaining the conditions necessary for continued recovery requires sustained commitment to reducing nutrient and sediment pollution throughout the watershed. The Potomac River's width at Maryland Point reaches 5 miles. Its expansion created by drowned river valleys flooded when sea levels rose after the Ice Age, transforming what was a relatively narrow river channel into a broad estuary where the boundary between river and bay becomes philosophical. The expansion occurs because the river here is flowing through its ancient valley, carved when sea levels were lower and the river had more gradient. And as water levels rose, the valley flooded, creating the wide expanse visible today. The width creates conditions more similar to the bay than to a river. Waves can build to several feet during storms, salinity approaches marine levels, and tidal influence dominates over freshwater flow except during major rain events. The point itself is a subtle feature, a slight prominence on the southern Maryland shore where the river begins its final widening before merging completely with the bay, and it's been a landmark for navigation since colonial times when ships would use it to gauge their progress upriver toward Alexandria and Washington. The river's expansion here demonstrates how post-glacial sea level rise has fundamentally altered the character of the Potomac's lower reaches, converting flowing river into tidal estuary and creating conditions that support species assemblages more typical of coastal waters than freshwater systems. Back Creek in Baltimore County flows through a valley carved when this area had a wetter climate, its current stream too small for the valley it occupies. Another example of underfit streams that persist in oversized valleys carved during glacial periods when discharge was higher. The valley is several hundred feet wide, while the creek itself is barely 20 feet across during normal flows. And this mismatch is visible in the flat valley floor that extends well beyond the active channel, evidence of a time when the creek spread across this entire surface during floods or when it carried greater volumes year-round. The oversized valley is common in areas affected by glacial climate, even though glaciers never reached this far south. Increased precipitation and altered vegetation during cold periods meant more runoff and higher stream flows, and as climate warmed and vegetation changed, flows decreased and streams shrank to their current dimensions. The valley now is attractive for development because it provides relatively flat land, though building in it means accepting flood risk during the rare events when the creek briefly reclaims its historical floodplain. The creek represents the persistence of landforms created under past conditions, geography that reflects not current processes, but the legacy of different climates operating on timescales that dwarf human history. Honga River on the eastern shore forms an estuary, where submerged aquatic vegetation once covered 2,000 acres, before disease and pollution reduced it to scattered patches, and recovery efforts now focus on restoring water quality to levels that might allow vegetation to reestablish. The river is tidal, brackish, and shallow, characteristics that once made it ideal for underwater grasses, but increased nutrient loading from agricultural runoff and development caused algae blooms that clouded the water and blocked light from reaching the bottom. The loss of vegetation cascaded through the ecosystem. Without grass beds to serve as nursery habitat, fish and crab populations declined, and without the grass to stabilize sediments and take up nutrients, water quality continued degrading in a self-reinforcing cycle. Breaking this cycle requires reducing nutrient inputs throughout the watershed, a process that takes years and requires coordinated action by many landowners and municipalities. Recent improvements have allowed some grass beds to return, particularly in areas where local conditions, depth, exposure, salinity are most favorable, and these recovering patches serve as seed sources that might gradually expand if water quality continues improving. The river demonstrates both how quickly ecosystems can degrade when conditions shift and how slowly they recover even after stressors are reduced. The restoration timeline, measured in decades rather than seasons. Ragged Mountain in Allegheny County contains caves formed in Ordovician limestone, deposited 450 million years ago when this area lay beneath a tropical sea where calcium carbonate precipitated from warm waters and accumulated on the seafloor along with the shells and skeletons of marine organisms. The limestone was later buried, compressed, and lithified, then uplifted and exposed by erosion, and finally dissolved by slightly acidic groundwater to create the caves that riddle the mountain's interior. The caves range from small crawlways to larger passages where underground streams flow, and exploring them requires navigating through darkness broken only by headlamps, the rock walls showing evidence of dissolution, smooth surfaces where water has flowed, pockets where softer layers eroded preferentially, breakdown where ceilings collapsed and created rooms filled with rubble. The caves maintain constant temperatures year-round, typically in the low 50s, and they provide habitat for bats that roost in the darkness during day and emerge at dusk to feed on insects. The caves represent negative space, voids created by removal rather than addition, and they continue evolving as groundwater flows through them, dissolving limestone and gradually expanding passages that will eventually collapse and be filled with sediment, creating new cave systems elsewhere in the mountain as the cycle of dissolution and collapse continues. The Chesapeake Bay's surface area of 4,480 square miles makes it the largest estuary in the United States, yet its average depth of 21 feet means it holds less water than many smaller but deeper bodies, giving it character more like an extensive shallow pond than an inland sea. This shallowness affects everything about the bay. It warms quickly in summer and cools quickly in fall. It's easily mixed by storms and tides. Sunlight can reach the bottom across vast areas, and its water quality responds rapidly to inputs from its watershed. The bay is really a drowned river valley. The ancient Susquehanna Valley flooded when glaciers melted and sea levels rose, and its shape reflects this origin with a main stem running north-south and tributaries entering from both sides. The bay's productivity results partly from its shallowness, which allows light to drive photosynthesis across extensive areas and creates habitat diversity from submerged grasses to tidal marshes to open water. Yet this same shallowness makes it vulnerable. There's no deep refuge where cold, clean water persists, no place isolated from surface processes, and changes in the watershed quickly affect the entire system. The bay represents a temporary condition, a particular configuration of land and water that has existed for only 10,000 years and will inevitably change as sea levels continue rising and the bay gradually becomes part of the ocean rather than a distinct estuary. And so, we've wandered through Maryland's quiet geography, from mountain summits where continental divides determine the ocean each raindrop will meet, to marshes where land dissolves so gradually into water that boundaries become suggestions rather than facts. We've traced rivers that remember their ancient courses, stood on islands that are slowly returning to the bay from which they emerged, and glimpsed stone that has witnessed 450 million years of patient transformation. This small state contains such variety, not through size, but through position. standing where coastal plain meets Piedmont meets mountain, where fresh water negotiates endlessly with salt, where the patient work of ice and water and wind has written its story in cliffs and valleys and channels that flow backward with the tides. We've seen how geography persists beneath surfaces, limestone dissolving into invisible caves, sediments accumulating grain by grain into beaches and barriers, rivers carving valleys during climates that no longer exist, but whose effects remain written in the shape of the land. Perhaps geography's greatest lesson is this: that permanence is relative, that even mountains are temporary, that shorelines migrate, and rivers change their minds, and islands appear and disappear like thoughts. What seems solid is simply moving slowly. The Chesapeake Bay itself is merely 10,000 years old, a drowned valley that will eventually become ocean as seas continue their patient rise. The mountains wear down at rates measured in fractions of millimeters per year, but given enough time, they will return to the plains from which they were uplifted. Maryland's geography is a conversation between rock and water, between the solid and the fluid, between what was and what is becoming. Every tide rewrites the shoreline slightly. Every rain carries mountains to the sea, particle by particle. Every season, the land adjusts to forces older than names, older than nations, older than the species currently observing and measuring and attempting to understand these patient transformations. Thank you for drifting through Maryland's landscape with me tonight. May your rest be as deep as the Chesapeake's ancient channels, as peaceful as water finding its level in a tidal marsh, as undisturbed as sediments settling slowly on a bay floor in the darkness far below the surface. Until we meet again, sleep well.